Order, please. We'll now begin with the daily routine, beginning with the Honourable Member for Cumberland South on an introduction.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to do an introduction in the gallery.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the House, I'd like to bring recognition to the West Gallery. The family I spoke about on Friday, the young boy Keegan Cowenberg that saved the house in Oxford on his way home from the local swimming hole and is recognized in Oxford as a local hero. His father's with him, Stephen Cowenberg, one of the firefighters in Oxford, and his mother Jennifer and his little brother, little Chief Brody. I'd like to give recognition and congratulations to Keegan on his heroic efforts, and thank you very much on behalf of the province.
We'll now move on to presenting and reading of petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. As Speaker of the House of Assembly and pursuant to Section 163 of the Elections Act, I'm pleased to table the following reports. The annual report of the Chief Electoral Officer for 2017-18, the Elections Nova Scotia Strategic Plan for 2018 to 2023, and Volume 3 of the Financial Information and Statistics. The reports are tabled. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today, September 13th, we recognize Stand Up Against Bullying Day and send a strong message against bullying in Nova Scotia. This is on a future day, Mr. Speaker. Stand Up Against Bullying in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia schools, colleges, and universities, and whereas on this day we reaffirm our commitment to stop bullying and respond effectively to unacceptable behaviours, including bullying, cyberbullying, violence, and all forms of harassment, and whereas government will commit to continue to support the development of safe, inclusive, and caring school environments where all students are safe, engaged, and able to learn. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge Stand Up Against Bullying Day and the commitment and dedication of our students, teachers, and education staff who work to eliminate bullying in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Will all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas A.F. Terrio & Son Limited of Matagan River was founded in 1938 and remains one of the largest privately owned boatyards in Atlantic Canada. And whereas Matagan River Company has combined traditional knowledge, techniques with the latest innovation and technology to proudly build more than 800 state-of-the-art vessels, including fishing boats, barges, ferries, yachts, and more. Whereas A.F. Terrio & Sons Limited continues to make a strong contribution to the maritime culture and economy of Nova Scotia. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate A.F. Terrio & Sons Limited on their 80th anniversary and their record of outstanding quality and performance and reliability. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? It is agreed. With all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on July 5th, 2018, the Honourable Member for Hants West was appointed to the Executive Council and resigned his position as Deputy Speaker of the House of Assembly. And whereas, pursuant to Rule 11 of the Rules and Forms of Procedures of this House, Deputy Speakers are to be elected by the House in the same manner as the Speaker. And whereas it is desirable for the House to elect the second Deputy Speaker as a result of the resignation of July 5th, 2018. Therefore, be it resolved that the Speaker preside over the election by the honourable members of the House of Assembly of a Deputy Speaker and Chairman of Committees forthwith. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas suicide remains one of the top 3 causes of injury-related death in the province, and whereas suicide is a complex and touches the lives of many Nova Scotians, and whereas government remains committed to providing important resources like the Mental Health Crisis Line, and we're continuing to update the suicide prevention framework to support Nova Scotians when they need it the most. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this legislature recognize September 10th as World Suicide Prevention Day. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Where today marks the 17th anniversary of September 11th terrorist attacks in the United States, where over 3,000 people lost their lives, whereas the events of that terrible day and the weeks and months that followed will never be forgotten. Whereas in the wake of that tragedy, Nova Scotians, including countless volunteers, first responders, employees of the Stanfield International Airport, and many others, once again demonstrated the kindness, generosity, and selflessness for which they are known. Therefore, be it resolved that all members, that all Nova Scotians stand with our American neighbours as we remember those who lost their lives on that terrible day. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. Is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. We'll now move on to introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 260 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Liquor Control Act.
The Honourable Minister of Finance begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 260 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Liquor Control Act.
Bill number 10, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 260 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Liquor Control Act.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 238 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Provincial Court Act, respecting sexual assault law education for judges.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 238 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Provincial Court Act respecting sexual assault law education for judges.
Bill number 11, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 238 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Provincial Court Act respecting sexual assault law education for judges.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 32 of the Acts of 2014, the Health Authorities Act, to require quarterly reports and an annual expenditure plan.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 32 of the Acts of 2014, the Health Authorities Act to require quarterly reports and an annual expenditure plan.
Bill number 12, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 32 of the Acts of 2014, the Health Authorities Act, to require quarterly reports and an annual expenditure plan.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce the bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 120 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Daycare Act.
The Honourable Minister of Education begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 120 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Daycare Act.
Bill number 13, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 120 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Daycare Act.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce the bill. An act addressing sexual violence at colleges and universities.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Address Sexual Violence at Colleges and Universities.
Bill number 14, entitled An Act to Address Sexual Violence at Colleges and Universities.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting an Advocate for Children and Youth.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting an Advocate for Children and Youth.
Bill number 15, entitled An Act Respecting an Advocate for Children and Youth.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill titled An Act Respecting Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Protection.
The Honourable Minister of Justice begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Protection.
Bill number 16, entitled An Act Respecting Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Protection.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 147 of the Acts of 1927, an Act to incorporate the Kensieville Cemetery Company. Sorry.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 147 of the Acts of 1927, an Act to incorporate the Kensieville Cemetery Company.
Bill number 17, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 147 of the Acts of 1927, an Act to incorporate the Kensieville Cemetery Company.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act entitled An Act to Amend Schedule A of Chapter 1 of the Acts of 2018, the Education Act, respecting the Provincial Advisory Council on Education.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter Schedule A of Chapter 1 of the Acts of 2018, the Education Act, respecting the Provincial Advisory Council on Education.
Bill number 18, entitled An Act to Amend Schedule A of Chapter 1 of the Acts of 2018, the Education Act, respecting the Provincial Advisory Council on Education.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, respecting an independent review commissioner.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, respecting an independent review commissioner.
Bill number 19, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, respecting an independent review commissioner.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 32 of the Acts of 2014, the Health Authorities Act, respecting board meetings.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 32 of the Acts of 2014, the Health Authorities Act, respecting board meetings.
Bill number 20, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 32 of the Acts of 2014, the Health Authorities Act, respecting board meetings.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, respecting compromised personal information.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, respecting compromised personal information.
Bill number 21, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 1993, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, respecting compromised personal information.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. We'll now move on to the Leader of the Official Opposition on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If I can have the members' attention to the West Gallery, I'd like to introduce my friend, Senator Michael McDonald. Welcome.
We'll now move on to notices of motion. Statements by members. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on September 11th, 2001, the world changed. Few Nova Scotians do not remember where they were when terrorists hijacked and crashed planes, including 2 into the World Trade Center. Out of that horror came a source of pride in our province. Halifax Stanfield accepted the greatest number of aircraft of any airport and was the first major airport to have all diverted flights back in the air. 40 aircraft carrying 8,000 passengers were diverted to Halifax Stanfield International. Members of Stanfield's airport community, along with so many Nova Scotians, opened their hearts and their homes. Accolades and thanks poured in from around the world. Nova Scotians were being Nova Scotians, the best neighbours one could ever have. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to echo the concerns raised by John Perkins, Gregor Wilson, Lydia and Paul Jenkinson, and other members of Sustainable Northern Nova Scotia. The expectation that the province will issue a mining mineral exploration permit this year in the Warwick Mountain and New Annan area is stirring fear amongst residents who worry that the French River watershed could be at risk. That provides the drinking water to Tatamagouche. 2 years ago, the Tatamagouche Source Water Protection Committee became aware of potential mining mineral extraction, and we know that mines and energy have been investing in the area. So, Mr. Speaker, we would would like to have a robust turnout for the department to follow through on its call for public opinion, and I hope that the Premier, Deputy Premier, and the Ministers of Natural Resources and Environment are paying attention. Thank you.
The honourable member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of Nova Scotians, I would like to express our sorrow and support for victims, first responders, and all families and friends who lived lives changed forever on September the 11th, 2001. This tragedy was felt all over the world, and here in Nova Scotia, hearts and homes were open to help those who were stranded and diverted from their planned travel destinations. Compassion and humility moved the residents of Nova Scotia, so comfort, support, and took into the homes many of the confused and shaken travelers. 40 planes and over 8,000 passengers and crews landed in Nova Scotia Stanfield International Airport. Nova Scotia was also changed that day. Many new relationships were built and thriving today. Mr. Speaker, please join me in thanking the caring and kind people of Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday was World Suicide Prevention Day. It was an opportunity for everybody in the community to join together to promote understanding about suicide and highlight the professionals and advocates that work so hard to prevent death by suicide. It is estimated that each day in Canada, 10 people end their lives and 200 make suicide attempts. The pain that leads individuals to take their lives is unimaginable, and their deaths leave countless family and friends bereaved and their communities impacted. The theme of this year's World Suicide Prevention Day is working together to prevent suicide. Mr. Speaker, it is important that we all do what we can to shine light on this important issue and to send a message of hope to those who live in despair and those who are grieving. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to share with members how much I am enjoying my annual Halifax Transit bus pass. I purchased mine as a top-up of my CarShare Atlantic membership and have used it far more than expected already. It's almost identical to the bus passes that income assistance recipients in Halifax now have through a collaboration between the city and the province, the Department of Community Services, except that their pass enables them to travel the extended routes, such as to the airport. I met an ESIA recipient this summer who was actually using her pass to go to the airport for work, cleaning cars for a rental company. I trust many income assistance recipients are taking the bus and enjoying it for social outings, education, and recreation, and I certainly hope so. There's no question that social isolation is a painful part of living in poverty. However, for those recipients who are not able to work, who do not have family members offering them additional support, and who used to use a part of their woefully inadequate check allocated for travel to spend on food or rent, this program has been a cause of hardship. An obvious solution would be to raise the rates.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate Katharine Mcphee on her dedication to our community. Katharine is a wife and mother of 2 young boys and works part-time at the Nova Scotia Health Authority. Raising a young family takes a huge commitment of time and energy, but Katharine still finds time to give back to her community. Despite her already busy life, Katharine still makes the time to volunteer in the community. She now serves as the president for the Urban Farm of Spryfield Museum Board. Katharine refers to the farm as her happy place and enjoys the work she does at the farm and the benefits the farm provides to the community she loves. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the members of the House join me in congratulating Katharine Mcphee for her dedication and commitment to the community. She certainly is a shining star and an inspiration for all of us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, today I would like to acknowledge the outstanding work performance of Nova Scotia Department of Environment Inspector Specialist Derek Peveril. As with all of Derek's colleagues, he believes in the value of integrity. Derek has been in and out of our constituency of Cole Harbour Eastern Passage for a multitude of investigations, and each visit he goes above and beyond to be sure the recipient understands and is very clear with the findings. This type of performance is driven with the type of kindness and compassion that we would all love to see more of. Derek has 6 years in his position, and our community looks forward to many more years of impressive service. It is a true honour to congratulate Derek and to thank him for all of his hard work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, this spring saw tragedy shake my community. A fatal fire at 81 Primrose Street and another one at 23 Brule on the same night left community members grieving and many of my constituents displaced. But in wake of these fires, we saw a community rally together. I want to express thanks and admiration to the first responders who arrived quickly and worked tirelessly to get the fires under control, who helped evacuate residents and who offered them comfort and protection in a moment of trauma. The members of the Dartmouth Masjid who quickly stepped up to offer shelter and food for those affected, even while observing Ramadan, proved once again what an integral part of our community's fabric they are. The Canadian Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the Disaster Animal Response Team of Nova Scotia, so many organizations helped our community navigate this tragedy, and I am grateful. And finally, Mr. Speaker, there were many, many constituents who called my office to offer assistance and to ask how they could help their neighbours. These people continuously remind me of what an honour it is to represent Dartmouth North. I'm proud to be a member of such a resilient community, and I'm humbled by the grace and generosity of the people in that community. Thank you.
The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to call your attention to a young man from Mahone Bay, Christian Heritage. Christian, age 42, was diagnosed at the age of 18 with schizophrenia. Christian also suffers from an osteo condition. Christian now does public speaking on the issue with the aim of reducing the stigma around mental illness. Christian had pounded the pavement prior to the Schizophrenia Society of Nova Scotia's 10th annual Road to Recovery Walk, which was held at the Halifax Commons on May 5th and raised over $5,000. Last year, he raised over $2,000. Christian is a popular local photographer and was the official photographer at this year's event. He produces cards with the photos and includes a picture of himself plus a brief description of his situation on the back. He hands these cards out and also sells them at various shops. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you and all members of this House of Assembly join me in congratulating Christian for his determination and involvement in raising over $7,000 in the past 2 years for the Schizophrenia Society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the International Breast Cancer Paddlers Commission Dragon Boat Festival is an international non-competitive event for breast cancer survivors who participate in dragon boat races as post-operative rehabilitation. This year, the festival was held in Florence, Italy. The event was created by Canadian sports medicine physician Dr. Don McKenzie about 20 years ago. This type of racing is considered the perfect activity for women who have survived breast cancer because the upper body movement is crucial to recovery. The Florence 2018 festival involved more than 4,000 people, 129 teams from 17 countries, and for the first time, all continents were represented. Congratulations to the members of a Pictou County contingent participating in the event and for winning a race during the two-day festival. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a moment to recognize a woman whose dogged efforts to document Nova Scotia's folklore, songs and history left us with a treasure trove of cultural heritage. This month, Helen Creighton would have been 119 had she lived to tell the tale. I'm in awe of this pioneering woman who had a multitude of careers before she became a folklorist. Helen was a driver with the Royal Flying Corps in Toronto and the Red Cross Caravan in Nova Scotia. She trained in social work at the University of Toronto, taught school in Mexico, and broadcast on CHNS radio, all in the early 1900s. I can only imagine she must have starred in as many tales as she recorded. Our cultural heritage is precious, Mr. Speaker, and it informs our way forward. Helen wasn't formally trained as a historian, but the work of this Dartmouth woman still informs the Nova Scotian identity today. She's received numerous awards for her achievements, but this month she was immortalized with a plaque from Parks Canada commemorating her national historic significance in her hometown of Dartmouth. Happy birthday, Helen.
The honourable member for Clayton Park West on an introduction.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make an introduction. In the East Gallery, we have Janine Panagiotakos, who's the. I would like to ask her to stand up to receive a warm welcome from the House. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize a woman who is providing entrepreneurs with access to affordable places to work. Janine Panagiotakos believes entrepreneurs are stuck between two choices: run a small business at home or invest money into a space and struggle to keep it. That is why, in January 2017, Janine founded Many Hats Workspace, an affordable shared workspace where business owners can collaborate with fellow entrepreneurs. Many Hats also offers its members admin and marketing support at reduced rates. Many Hats is located in Clayton Park West on the 3rd floor of the Bedford Basin Market. There are 42 active members sharing 16 offices, 2 large co-working spaces, plus a conference room. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the members of this House of Assembly join me in congratulating Janine on her success and thanking her for changing the way that we think about business space.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to acknowledge that 17 years ago, our comfortable Western world stopped turning for a moment. Life has been different since September 11, 2001. Our airline industry is forever changed. Security remains at the top of our minds. On this solemn anniversary, I think of all the victims of this terror attack and their families. I think of the heroic first responders that tend to get forgotten, the flight crew. Mr. Speaker, whether it was bravery displayed on the ground, saving lives, and the recovery effort, or the bravery displayed in the air, staring the attackers in the face, September 11th was a day where a few people showed their darkest side. But, Mr. Speaker, many more showed superhuman heroism. I ask all members of this House and all Nova Scotians, rather than think of sadness on this solemn anniversary, think of bravery. Let us be kind to people today and every day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As summer draws to a close, I'd like to acknowledge the staff at Dalhousie Agricultural Campus in Truro, who in August launched the bicentennial Botanical Garden housed at the Bible Hill campus. Open to the public, a stroll through the garden will find a range of flora including Scots pine, chestnut trees, black ash or wisquick, a tree traditionally used by Mi'kmaq for making baskets and other household items. There are also 3,000 types of flowering plants blooming across 26 acres of plant collections. So congratulations to the staff and botanists who maintain this important collection for the edification and education of our students and public. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize Matt Croft, winner of the 2018 Biggs Award from the Flower Cart in New Minas. This award highlights workers who have become excellent role models for others and demonstrates the work skills taught by the Flower Cart Group's partners in employment services. The Biggs Award allows the Flower Cart to recognize community employer partners and for employers to recognize great employees such as Matt. Matt has developed his skills at the Tim Hortons in New Minas and has worked with Valley Waste Resource Management and Michelin in the past. I would ask all members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in congratulating Matt Croft on this well-deserved award and to wish him all the best in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to note the passing of Helene Van Donique, an international expert on the treatment of oiled birds. In a past statement in the legislature, I mentioned her successful petition to eliminate the use of lead in hunting and fishing. Dr. Van Donique, with her husband Murdo Messer, operated the Cobequid Wildlife Rehabilitation Centre and was recipient in July of the Canadian Veterinarian Medical Association's Humane Award for her dedication to caring for injured wildlife. Dr. Van Donique, whose efforts have been recognized by her professional community many times, was unable to attend the award due to health concerns, and on August the 11th, lost her battle with ovarian cancer. Dr. Donique will be sorely missed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to congratulate and thank Shauntae Grant, who this week launches her latest children's picture book, Africville, published by House of Anansi and illustrated by Eva Campbell. The launch will happen on Thursday at the Africville Museum as part of the Prismatic Festival. Shante is a storyteller, a writer, former Halifax Poet Laureate, and a multidisciplinary artist in music and theatre. Her previous books for children, including Up Home and The City Speaks and Drums, have earned a special spot on bookshelves at storytime and bedtime and feature beautiful illustrations of Black children as protagonists. This story follows a girl visiting the site of Africville during the annual reunion who imagines what that vibrant community was like. As a mom who lives around the corner from Africville and whose kids will still sometimes climb on my lap, I am grateful for this way to explore with them the vibrant heritage of African Nova Scotians and the systemic racism they have endured, which we must constantly work to redress. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize and congratulate Yarmouth's Bobby Lou Reardon. Bobby Lou completed the Big Swim, which helps raise funds for Camp Brigadoon, a camp for kids living with health conditions and challenges. Bobby Lou swam from New Brunswick to PEI, a long and cold swim. Bobby Lou and the other swimmers who participated helped to raise more than $160,000, which will give 160 children the opportunity to attend one of the 14 summer programs at Camp Brigadoon. I ask this House of Assembly to join me in congratulating Bobby Lou Reardon on this truly amazing feat and in thanking her for her hard work and dedication to such a meaningful cause.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, serving on a police force is among the most noble of callings. This summer, 4 graduating cadets from the Atlantic Police Academy did their on-the-job training with the Truro Police Service. Among these cadets was Brady Meach, who grew up in Truro and studied criminology right here in Halifax at St. Mary's University before heading to the police academy. As a kid, Brady dreamed of being a police officer, and he hung on to this dream because of his passion for helping people. He's also the grandson of a very good friend of our party, Roseanne McIsaac. Now graduated, Brady is hoping to stay here in Nova Scotia to serve in his home province. Mr. Speaker, I invite all members to congratulate Brady Meach and his classmates on graduating from the Atlantic Police Academy and wish them the best of luck in their policing careers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to mourn the lives lost to suicide all over our province. Yesterday, September 10th, was World Suicide Prevention Day. Suicide is a leading cause of death among Canadians and one of the top 2 causes of those under 35. Sadly, rates are still on the rise in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, suicide is a preventable cause of death. Prevention begins with working to remove the stigma attached to its leading causes: depression, mental illness, trauma, addiction, and isolation, and to work as hard as we can to offer compassion and treatment in their stead. Please join me in recognizing this devastating issue, and as leaders, let us heed the theme of this year's Day of Recognition and work together to prevent suicide.
The honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Blarney Stone, a small restaurant in Hebbs Cross, provides locals and travellers with a variety of home-style meals, from hot sandwiches and burgers to local seafood, including some of the best clams and fish available on the South Shore. The Blarney Stone has been operated by the same family for the past 32 years, first Gary McLeod and now by his son Shaun. Together they have developed a strong reputation on the South Shore and across the province as a first-rate family restaurant that offers quality, consistency and value. They are currently ranked #1 on TripAdvisor and have received many awards from the South Shore Breaker and their Reader's Choice. Last March, the Blarney Stone won the 2017 Hospitality Business Excellence Award presented by the Lunenburg Queens Business Excellence Association. Mr. Speaker, congratulations to the Blarney Stone for receiving the 2017 Hospitality Award and for their outstanding service. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sackville Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as some members of the House may recognize by my tie today, September is Prostate Cancer Awareness Month. All men over 50 and those over 40 with a family history of the disease should, without fail, go to see their GPs about their prostate. In Canada, it is estimated that 21,000 new cases of prostate cancer, and every year 4,100 Canadian men die from the disease. The examination, Mr. Speaker, is easy, painless, and only takes a few moments to help ensure peace of mind. Most importantly, this disease, if caught early, can be cured, and of course there are new treatments being developed all the time. Mr. Speaker, I encourage every male MLA in the House, as well as Nova Scotian men across this province, to book an appointment with their family physician today for a checkup. Thank you.
The honourable member for Antigonish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in the Assembly to recognize the Member of Parliament for Central Nova on a recent appointment. On August 31st, 2018, the Prime Minister of Canada announced changes to Parliamentary Secretaries. Shaun, Fraser, the MP for Central Nova, was named Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, Shaun was elected as MP in 2015. Since then, he has served on the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities, as well as the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. In his new role, MP Fraser's responsibilities include taking questions during question period, working with fellow MPs, and collaborating with stakeholders regarding environment-related policies. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate Shaun on his new appointment and wish him the best of luck in this new role. I know he will do well.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge the commemoration of Queens County hometown hero and Nova Scotia Sport Hall of Fame inductee Tiger Warrington and a life-size statue created by the tremendously talented Ivan Higgins from Cosby's Garden Centre and Sculpture Garden in Brooklyn. 40 years after his death, Tiger, who was an outstanding athlete and well-respected community member, has been immortalized through this statue on the waterfront of his hometown of Liverpool. This has been a dream of his family members for many years, and thanks to the efforts and generous donation of the J&W Murphy Foundation, the support of the Privateer Days Commission, it has finally become a reality. Congratulations to everyone involved. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bedford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, a number of the members in this House celebrated the achievements of Nova Scotia's Special Olympians and the extraordinary National Summer Games held in Antigonish this summer. I want to congratulate a Bedford resident, a neighbour, on her terrific showing at the Special Olympics National Summer Games. Hannah Hicks won 5 medals in rhythmic gymnastics, 1 gold, 3 silver, and a bronze. Hannah won gold in the hoop, but she says her favourite apparatus is the ribbon. And I should tell you that Hannah is also a talented artist. In fact, members can purchase her cards at the protocol office. Hannah is an exceptional young woman, and I know members of this House want to join me in congratulating Hannah Hicks on her medal-winning performances at the Games. Way to go, Hannah.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to recognize the organizers and volunteers involved in the annual Big Pond Festival Sunday concert. This concert has been running annually for 54 years. Again this year, it drew a standing room only crowd. This year's show was dedicated to the memory of the late Reverend Joe Gillis, better known as Father Joe, who died this year at the age of 87. Father Joe served throughout the Diocese of Antigonish, including serving St. Mary's Parish in Big Pond and Sacred Heart in nearby Johnstown. This year's concert featured many local artists, including Aaron Lewis, Kimberly Fraser, Kinnan and Betty Beaton, Marilyn McDonald McKinnon, Keith McDonald, Doug McPhee, Jason Roach, and Colin Grant. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the organizers, volunteers, and performers of the Big Pond Festival Sunday Concert who continue to present a successful and Cape Breton-rich event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Not Since Moses Run first took place in 5 Islands, and this year on July 15th, it was the 10th anniversary for the run. During some of those years, Mr. Speaker, there have been over 1,000 runners participating. The run is made possible by the powerful tides of the Bay of Fundy. At low tide, the exposed ocean floor becomes the racetrack for the run. It has been likened to the parting of the Red Sea that allowed Moses and the Israelites to flee Egypt. There is a 5K run, 10K run, both noted for their spectacular scenery, and for the children under 12, a wonderful experience called the Basket Run. Not Since Moses is a not-for-profit run. Members of the planning team are all people who have grown up, lived, and worked along the shore, and who are proud of what they see and want to share the beauty with others. Over 100 local volunteers assist each year with, and this is what is considered by many to be the most unique running event in the world. Runners get to view the magnificent cliffs that are normally only seen from boats. After their first experience, Mr. Speaker, many runners, including tourists, return to the area. Mr. Speaker, I invite all members of this House to join the run next year. You run, I'll volunteer.
Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate the South Shore Flying Club for the tremendous work they are doing at South Shore Regional Airport near Greenfield. Since taking over the operation of the airport from the Region of Queens Municipality, the club has also leased some land for the potential construction of hangars and the terminal building, which they have beautifully renovated. Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend the volunteers from the Flying Club for their hard work in breathing new life into this rural airport that has so much potential as an economic driver for the South Shore of Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to see that Heritage Day 2018 has created momentum to deepen our insights and appreciation of the life of Mona Parsons, this year's honoree. Andrea Hill-Lear's book, Mona Parsons, From Nova Scotia to Nazi Europe, From Privilege to Prison, is now a stage production. The Bitterest Time, the war story of Mona Parsons, was written by Andrea Hill-Lear and Sarah Jane Blinkhorn, and directed by Rianne Chisholm. Played to a full house on September 7 and 8 at the Al Whittle Theatre in Wolfville. In the performance, Mona is played by Amanda LeBlanc, who not only shines a light on the experiences of women of war, but also reminds us of the power of memory and of art, of music, of poetry, to give meaning to our lives, especially in hard times like a Nazi prison. I want to extend congratulations to Lunacy Theatre and Serendipity Theatre. This gem of a production will play this week in Antigonish, Pictou, and Neptune. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, my friend Laura Walker has worked tirelessly to shine a light on the need to improve mental health in this province. Earlier this year, Laura lost a good friend of hers to suicide. I'm so proud of her for continuing to keep the conversation going for mental health care, while at the same time grieving and honouring the life of her friend. On Saturday, I joined my friend Laurel, my colleague John Lohr, for a suicide awareness walk in the Valley. Yesterday was World Suicide Awareness Day. Every 72 hours, on average, we lose another Nova Scotian to suicide. Like Laurel, my family and many other Nova Scotians, we have shared in their family experiences with mental health. May we all be committed to improving mental health services and saving lives in this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just like to remind the Honourable Member not to refer to other current Honourable Members of this House by their proper names. The Honourable Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hants East has a proud history of champions in several sports, and with the accomplishments of this young woman, the future is looking bright as well. Rugby player Megan Sullivan has been awarded the 19 and over Female of the Year at the East Hants Sports Awards Gala. She was also named the 2017 Most Valuable Player of the Enfield RFC Women's. Her rugby skills saw her scoring 16 times in 8 games. She was a dominant force for her team. She has led them to championship victories in the 2017 Oktoberfest Sevens, 2018 Truro Sevens, and the 2018 Sweetheart Seven Constellation. Megan Sullivan is a consistent leader in the field and a force in the rugby community, bringing her best to every game. And I'd like to offer this dynamic young woman our congratulations for her efforts and accomplishments in the sport of rugby, and wish her all the best in every future endeavour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was with a heavy heart that I draw attention to the House. Attention to the House is the death of Herb Pepperdine at age 95. Herb was the last man to emerge from underground after the 1958 bump in the Spring Hill mine disaster. He started working in the mines when he was only 14 years old. Even after the disaster, he continued to work underground 10 more years. In October 1958, Herb was among 174 men underground when the No. 2 mine exploded. 75 men perished. He spent 8 days underground without food or water. He had almost given up hope when he was rescued. Herb Pepperdine is a testament to the hardworking, tenacious spirit of thousands of Nova Scotians who worked in the mines. His death marks an end of an era. Mr. Speaker, I know all members will join me in extending sincere condolences to his family and friends of Herb Pepperdine at this sad time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday I had the pleasure of attending the grand opening for Leigh Evelyn's art exhibit at Secord Gallery on Kimball Road. Leah is an ASCAD graduate, an incredible local artist, and I urge all members and everyone to, if they have a chance, to take in this great local talent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to recognize Scottsburn as being home to Pictou County's newest museum, a walk through time. Alan Fraser always had a keen interest in history and the preservation of antique items and has been collecting for over 3 decades. These antiques were being held inside barns on his property in Scottsburn. Alan purchased the old Scottsburn Creamery building and knew right away what he could use the extra space for. There are items dating from the 1800s up until the 1950s, including household appliances, farming equipment, sleds, and carriages. Alan hopes that the museum will be used for school tours to teach local children of daily life in the past. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to thank Alan for keeping our important rural history alive for all to see. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Clare Digby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to once again recognize the important impact A.F. Theriault & Son has had and will continue to have on our economy. An impact expected to increase with the expansion project just started this spring. The shipyard, one of the oldest in the province, is now working at a capacity in an industry where demand is growing. The $6.65 million expansion will double its capacity and create 40 more skilled manufacturing and engineering jobs. When completed, the shipyard will have a new marine railway and a new office building. This will mean the company will be able to build and service vessels and work on vessels of over 1,500 tons. Our government and the Government of Canada has committed to invest in the future of the shipyard. We expect all A.F. Theriault, we all expect A.F. Theriault, a company founded by Gus Theriault in 1938 and now managed by his grandchildren, to continue to thrive and have a greater impact on our local economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I would like to recognize a very courageous 14-year-old girl, Emmy Morin. On August 12, 2018, Emmy partook in the 8th annual event called the Big Swim. Participants made the attempt to swim the Northumberland Strait from Cape Juryman, New Brunswick, to Borden, Prince Edward Island, a total of 15 kilometres. The Big Swim is all part of a fundraiser for Brigadoon Village, a not-for-profit camp for children and youth living with chronic illness. With strong tidal currents, Emmy swam 19.8 kilometres. The journey took her 6 hours and 37 minutes to complete. Emmy was able to raise $3,165, which will send 3 extraordinary children to camp. To date, the Big Swim has raised over $170,000. I ask all MLAs in the legislature to join me in congratulating Emmy and all those who completed the swim, and thank her for raising the money for other children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Guysborough Eastern Shore Tracadie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in celebration of the grand opening of the Shedabuckto Lifestyle Complex that took place on June 29th in the Shire town of Guysborough. I was honoured to be part of the ribbon-cutting ceremony and was so pleased to thank the hundreds of community members for working so hard to see this project through to the finish line. This beautiful new multi-use facility is bustling with sporting events, healthy living program, and various community events. The children have really made the space their own with unorganized play, riding bikes, rollerblading, and just playing tag. I look forward to the bustling crowds throughout the winter months with the shinny rink, the figure-8 skating oval, and hot chocolate around the fire pit. This past Saturday, the facility hosted the 3rd annual Grand Fondo with almost 500 registered bicyclers. Mr. Speaker, the people of Guysborough and surrounding communities deserve the abundance of physical, mental, and social health benefits that this remarkable infrastructure will grant for many years to come. I wholeheartedly congratulate them on their efforts and encourage them all to go out on that beautiful new soccer field and track and take their fully merited victory lap. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, tears of joy started streaming down Stacey Saunders' face as she waited to take the podium to receive her gold medal in the 100-metre during the Special Olympics Canada 2018 Summer Games in Antigonish. The Team Nova Scotia member also earned gold as a member of the 4x100-metre relay team and a silver in the shot put. Stacey lives in Stellarton and was overjoyed with her success. Her hard work, training, commitment and dedication brought her to that moment. Stacey's goal is to be a member of Team Canada for the 2019 Special Olympics World Summer Games in Abu Dhabi. She also completes in floor hockey, basketball, and hockey. I am sure all members of this legislature will join me in wishing Stacey Saunders great success in her future competitions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much for those member statements. We'll now enjoy a few minutes, a couple of seconds of solitude while we await question period. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. I spoke last week of a young woman in Truro who was the survivor of sexual assault. She went to the Colchester East Hants Health Centre and did not receive the care that no Nova Scotians would expect. According to StatsCan, in 2017, there were over 1,000 reported cases of sexual assault, and Mr. Speaker, a quarter of those were children. We know that instances of sexual assault are tragically underreported. Hopefully, we will see this start to change, but change will only come when this government changes. Stories like the one out of Truro are very discouraging to survivors who want to come forward. Will the Premier give survivors of sexual assault confidence they will be treated with compassion by putting in place dependable supports in every part of our province?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. She is absolutely right. When someone comes forward, Mr. Speaker, they need to be surrounded with the appropriate supports. They need to be done so, Mr. Speaker, in a timely manner. It's why in 2013 we invested in the first ever sexual assault strategy here in the province. We continue to invest in transition houses. She knows the Department of Justice provides support across our entire province. And the same program that the Honourable Member is referring to is one, Mr. Speaker, that we as a government are committed to ensuring is all across our province. What I said before, and I continue to say, the reason it's not in some places is ensuring that we have the appropriate training for those nurses that will need additional training that requires, and it takes time, and we're working with our partners to ensure that that happens.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January, community groups that support survivors of sexual violence in Nova Scotia said they'd likely have to turn people away without an extension of funding for the sexual violence strategy. The funding was $2 million per year. One advocate argued that it is unethical for the province not to offer a long-term solution, especially because more victims are coming forward. And I can table that document, Mr. Speaker. Despite all of this, the $2 million that is earmarked for 18-19 budget will be spread between domestic violence and sexual assault. No matter how you look at it, that means less money for sexual violence. Will the Premier immediately restore and enhance the funding for sexual assault victims?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As she has alluded into her question, I want to remind her we were the first government to make an investment to ensure that we have a sexual assault strategy. We said at the very beginning that would be a 3-year program that we worked with our partners across the province. Following that, we built in for the first time ever $1 million into the base of the community service budget to deal specifically with sexual assault strategy. She would also know that we've invested through the Department of Justice across our province to make sure that we have supports working with. She would also know, Mr. Speaker, that we have dedicated supports in public prosecution to ensure that when someone comes forward, public prosecutors have the appropriate training to deal with this very important issue.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
The last sitting of the legislature, the PC caucus raised the issue of sexual assault outreach at the reduction in funding. We asked the Public Accounts Committee to examine the issue. The committee agreed, but the witnesses were never called, Mr. Speaker. The committee wrapped up its business 3 weeks early without addressing the issue. Now the government has wiped out the scheduled meetings, meaning it could be months before the topic is ever considered again. Will the Premier explain why this government is going out of their way to avoid talking to sexual assault victims?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to thank her again, and I want to remind her of the work that we've been doing with our partners across the province. I also want to remind her that the last time her party was in power, Mr. Speaker, we put on the floor of this legislature in opposition a bill around domestic violence, which, by the way, we've implemented when we came to government. Their party was prepared to trade it off on a scrap metal bill, Mr. Speaker. We don't say one thing in opposition, Mr. Speaker. When we have a chance to make a difference in the lives of Nova Scotians, we did.
The Honourable Leader for the New Democratic Party.
On the day following National Suicide Prevention Day, I want to point out to the Premier that if he or I or anyone should find ourselves today overwhelmed, and we should make our way to avail ourselves of the health authorities' community-based mental health services, for example, particularly in Halifax at Bayers Lake, we would be given an appointment to be seen by a clinician in 10, 11, 12 months' time. And so I want to ask the Premier if he will acknowledge that something is deeply out of whack when in our province, from one end to the other, we have people coming forward for help and having to wait 6, 8, 10, 11, 12 months just to get their foot into the door for an appointment.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. This very important and serious question. One of the members from the official opposition read a member statement as well in this House. We know that all of us have been impacted. It is important that these services are made available across our province. We're working to continue to work with our partners to ensure that we do that. It's also important that we learn to identify the issue very early on in the onsets of mental health challenges that our loved ones are experiencing and our neighbours are experiencing. It's why we've made this investment early on in the education system to make a wraparound services to ensure that we get early detection, because we all know that the earlier we detect these issues, the better the outcomes.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
It is not a matter of what the Premier or the government intends. It is a matter of what the government achieves. The fact of the matter is that today, in Nova Scotia, we have a suicide rate considerably above the national average, while the percentage of our health budget, which is dedicated to mental health, is considerably below the national average. And we have a government which took funds away from Eating Disorders Nova Scotia, Schizophrenia Society of Nova Scotia, and the Canadian Association of Mental Health. So I want to ask the Premier if he can understand why there are a lot of people who feel that his government's record on mental health has fallen far short of what it should be.
The Honourable Premier.
For the question, Mr. Speaker, we continue to work with our partners across the province to ensure that we provide the supports that community members need, that family members need. Mr. Speaker, we as a government will continue to do that. I want to assure the honourable member we take the very issue that he's raised here in the House of the floor of the House of Assembly very seriously. The Minister of Health, along with his partners across the executive table, Mr. Speaker, continue to make sure that we have the supports in place. Is there more work to do? Of course there is, Mr. Speaker. There's always ongoing work, and we look forward to continuing to work with those partners to ensure that we continue to provide those supports to our communities.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Yesterday, suicide prevention advocate Laurel Walker said in an interview, which I'll table, that no system, our system is built around Band-Aid solutions and only treating the worst when they have to go to the ER and they're really in a crisis. She said the funding for mental health in Nova Scotia is inadequate. I agree with her. The province is full of people who, on the basis of experience in their own families, agree with her. And I want to ask the Premier if he accepts what Ms. Walker has had to say as a fair characterization, a fair assessment of where we are after 5 years of the Liberal government on the file of mental health.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I think an important part in the honourable member's question was talking about when people would present themselves in our healthcare facilities. What I've said very early on, we need to make sure that we have the supports there and in community-based mental health services. But I think it's equally as important, Mr. Speaker, that we recognize early detection of mental health issues is important for outcomes, important for the individual, and important for families. It's why we continue to make investments so that we can ensure that we can identify these issues early in the onsets with our children and with the wraparound and supports we're providing in the public education system, so we continue to have better outcomes, Mr. Speaker, for all of our families.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Researchers call the first weeks of school the red zone because sexual violence spikes on post-secondary campuses. Students, particularly those in first year, face a higher risk of being assaulted during this season of back-to-school parties, new people, new places. Ontario, Manitoba, British Columbia, and Quebec all have legislation requiring post-secondary institutions to develop sexual violence policies. Nova Scotia doesn't. Will the minister act immediately to protect students by introducing legislation that requires Nova Scotian universities to put sexual violence plans in place?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for bringing this issue to the floor of the legislature. I'd like to reiterate that what our government has done is put this strategy in place in the MOU. Every university is expected to have a sexual assault violence strategy in place. And as well, Mr. Speaker, not only did we put in the MOU, if the universities do not have it in place, there's financial penalties that the universities incur because of it. We felt that this was a very strong message to the universities. But, Mr. Speaker, more importantly, every university has been in step with our government, and they are bringing these sexual assault strategies forward because they know that even one sexual assault is one too many. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his answer. It does sound fairly positive. Student organizations are leading the charge to keep their members safe on campus, and I applaud them for this. Because of their efforts, the federal government is even considering withdrawing funding from universities and colleges that are not implementing best practices to deal with campus sexual violence. It is a clear indication that the time for talk is over, Mr. Speaker, and that there needs to be real concrete action to help protect students. So in the absence of legislation, will the minister consider attaching financial consequences to schools that fail to take appropriate action, but let us know what those fines will be in total?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, right now, what we've put forward to the universities, the fines will be their increases, which can be as much as $3 million per year. But, Mr. Speaker, I do want to say I want everyone in this House to know that the universities were part of the process. The student groups we're talking about were part of the process. They brought a sexual assault strategy forward to myself as the minister, and this was started under the previous minister. It was fully accepted. The universities are actually ahead of schedule implementing it. We're very pleased about that. And, Mr. Speaker, again, I will reiterate that, you know, as we've heard in the legislature today, times are changing, and we are pleased that the universities are moving forward. We want victims to come forward, and we want no victims at all to have anything horrible like this happen to them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A question for the Minister of Health. Yesterday, the NSHA's Senior Director of Medical Affairs said that the Department of Health did not have a recruitment plan to pass along to the newly created Health Authority back in 2016. Seems odd, Mr. Speaker, to promise a doctor for every Nova Scotian 3 years prior without a plan for how to recruit them. So I'd like to ask the Minister, does the Minister think that 4 years is too long to wait for a plan while thousands of Nova Scotians don't have a family physician?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. As the member would know, part of the challenge I think that was being referred to is that you have a variety of different health authorities, districts within the province, different approaches to recruitment throughout the province. Bringing together a single health authority provides that opportunity to look at our province as a whole. This has resulted in a number of, I believe, improvements in identifying where needs are, how we implement, as the member mentioned, taking action with our incentives to help with recruitment, like our tuition relief program, and also our locum initiatives. Mr. Speaker, all of those initiatives taking place, and we've been learning from the experience and frontline healthcare workers to make those improvements on the ground.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know 56,000 Nova Scotians are on the waiting list for a family doctor, and last spring the minister did announce a suite of major incentives designed to encourage doctors to take patients off the waiting list, saying, Mr. Speaker, that these changes offered more choice and added incentives to practice here in Nova Scotia. However, Mr. Speaker, upon closer inspection, these incentives isn't available for physicians starting a new practice, for example. In fact, to be eligible for these incentives, physicians must have been practicing for at least 2 years or have more than 1,350 patients on their roster, Mr. Speaker. So can the minister explain why he suggested these incentives would bring more doctors, family doctors to Nova Scotia, when it excludes those at the very beginning of their career, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for taking the opportunity to bring the suite of incentives that we announced in the spring that we developed in collaboration with Doctors Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, to the floor of the House. The member is making reference to one particular incentive out of a suite of about 5 or 6 different initiatives, Mr. Speaker. The one that he's referring to was designed to encourage the expansion of existing collaborative practices and comprehensive family care being provided in the province to attach patients to a family practice. The other incentives, Mr. Speaker, that we've provided include increasing the compensation for comprehensive family care, Mr. Speaker. It's incentives like that, increasing the compensation that's available to our physicians, that's attractive not just for retaining physicians, but also recruiting new ones.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Community Services. In a presentation to the Standing Committee on Community Services, the Sexual Assault Services Network of Nova Scotia said there is no statistical indication that the Liberal sexual violence strategy has reduced sexualized violence in Nova Scotia. In fact, they said the strategy increased the demand for comprehensive services as people are more often coming forward to report sexualized violence. Unfortunately, the same group of advocates said that long-term comprehensive services are not available. And as a healthcare professional in Nova Scotia, I have seen the lifelong consequences on one's mental and physical health when those services are not provided. My question to the minister is, why has the Liberal government refused to provide funding for long-term comprehensive services for survivors of sexual assault?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will address my answer to services provided by Community Services. I want to confirm for the honourable member that we do, in fact, provide services for the prevention of sexual assault through the Department of Community Services. We have $1 million in funding going forward, prevention innovation grants, Mr. Speaker. And I would note that I would not simply take our plan to combat sexual assault as the cause for more people coming forward. I think the Me Too movement had something to do with that, and I commend those who have come forward. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of anybody who has ever experienced a sexual assault, $1 million in prevention is nowhere near enough. So my question to the Minister of Community Services, the story of the young woman who waited for 3 days to get a SANE exam and the horrific story of the young Truro woman who was turned away from a hospital without any care show that short-term services for victims of sexual assault are inadequate. And experts in the field say that long-term services are not available but are critical. In Nova Scotia, we do not have these services available, and the majority of people who are sexually violated are done so by someone that they know, making this an even more complex issue. So my question to the minister is, will the minister admit that the province has not done enough for sexual violence victims and to act immediately to ensure that there are greater services both for prevention as well as appropriate services for long-term care available when and where they are needed?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for her question, and we always want anyone who is the victim of sexual assault to have the kind of supports that they need to get over this. What I will say is that we do have an online training course, Mr. Speaker, that helps all of us better provide support for people who are victims of sexual assault. I would encourage all members of this House to reach out and take that Supporting Survivors of Sexual Assault course. You can do it online. Mr. Speaker, we are also developing programs that better reach those who often don't come forward, because what we do know is that young people, and often particularly women, but people in marginalized communities like Aboriginal Nova Scotians, African Nova Scotians often don't come forward. So we are, in fact, working on providing better services to those populations as well. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton, Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2015, Nova Scotians were horrified to learn that a victim of sexual violence was forced to wait 3 days for a sexual assault nurse examiner team to travel from Antigonish to New Glasgow. To make that awful story go away, this government told Nova Scotians not to worry. They were investing $700,000 to expand the sexual assault nurse examiner program to Cape Breton and the South Shore. Nova Scotians trusted this government to keep its word to them and to survivors of sexual assault, but the trust was misplaced, Mr. Speaker. More than 3 years later, the same program has not been established in Cape Breton. Mr. Speaker, it's 3 years. Why hasn't the minister followed through on the promise to provide these crucial services to the people of Cape Breton Island?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising the question. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we've been following through with this commitment to expand SANE services, and the member's preambles made reference to New Glasgow. I had a meeting earlier this week with the Antigonish Women's Resource Centre, which provides SANE services to the Antigonish and surrounded areas, including coordinating the services out of the New Glasgow region. Mr. Speaker, it was a very positive meeting. They appreciate the work that we're providing and the support that I've provided both as MLA, Mr. Speaker, advocating their behalf long before I came into this position. The work for expansion in the SANE services, just as recently as last week, program was launched in, I believe, the Yarmouth community. Work is ongoing. As the Premier said in an earlier question, it takes time to get people the training that they need to fulfill the requirements and deliver those services.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind the Minister that New Glasgow is not on Cape Breton Island. 3 years ago, women were forced to wait days for a SANE examination. That is a situation that never should have been allowed to happen, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, things have become even worse. Very recently, we learned that a young woman who has been sexually assaulted was turned away from a hospital, having been given only some pamphlets. Not medical advice, not an offer of a SANE examination. All our system could provide her was a few pieces of glossy paper. Mr. Speaker, how can Nova Scotians trust this minister to ensure victims of sexual assault get the care they need when they already let them down on a promise of a SANE program on Cape Breton Island?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I've mentioned, work is continuing with our partners throughout the province, expanding these services. Mr. Speaker, to the specific case that the member referenced about obtaining SANE services, obviously this program is relatively new in the history of the province. I want to assure her and all members of this legislature and the members of the public that having an assessment can be provided within hospitals throughout the province. Certainly there are enhanced services provided by SANE, the sexual assault nurse examiners, and that work is going to continue with these expansions, including Cape Breton, the South Shore, and as we've mentioned, Northern Shore as well.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. Every person who experiences sexualized violence should have the opportunity to present themselves at a hospital, if available, to have evidence collected by a healthcare professional. Every person who experiences sexualized violence should have the opportunity to report the incident to police in a respectful, safe, and trauma-informed environment. And every person who experiences sexualized violence, either recent or historical, should have access to a specialized sexual assault therapist. My question to the minister is, does the minister agree that it's only ethical to have these services available for all people who experience sexualized violence, no matter what part of the province they live in?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we agree that services for people presenting as victims of sexual assault, sexualized violence, do need to get the care and compassionate way. I want to assure the member opposite that, in fact, they can present at hospitals and receive the examination by healthcare providers, by physicians throughout the province to collect the evidence. As we noted, the SANE program is an enhanced service that is also available in parts of the province. We've committed to continue the expansion of that program, and that work is ongoing, as recently as last week announcing the activation of that program in the Yarmouth region.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, people who experience sexualized violence live in different communities across our province, not just Halifax, Antigonish, Pictou, and Colchester County. People who experience sexualized violence should not have to tell their story over and over again as it re-victimizes them. People who experience sexualized violence deserve timely and confidential support by a professional who is appropriately trained in a safe environment. My question to the minister is he prepared to fund specialized sexual violence, trauma, therapeutic counselling in this current budget to all parts of the province, or is he okay with parts of the province not having access to this service?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I thank the member for bringing this important issue to the floor of the legislature. Indeed, we continue to expand and provide services for people who have suffered sexualized violence. That included the services around sexual assault therapists, as well as the expansion of the SANE program, Mr. Speaker. This is work that's ongoing and will continue to expand across the province.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. When university students returned to campus last week, they returned to the fastest rising tuition fees in the country. This year, average tuition fees have gone up 5.5%, almost double the national average. And since this government came to office, they've gone up a total of 26%. We now have the second highest tuition fees in the country, and the minister's policies have us on track to have the highest. So my question for the minister is this: does the minister think skyrocketing tuition fees are good for Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives us an opportunity now to talk about the excellent universities we have in this province, as well as the excellent programs they offer. This is why university students from all over the country come here. We bring in more students per capita than any other province. Mr. Speaker, the member is right. The tuition fees reflect the quality of education, but Mr. Speaker, we could possibly have lower fees if the NDP hadn't cut 10% from the university's budgets.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I am getting so tired of this government trying to throw a former government from like 7 years ago under the bus. Get with the program here, folks. Students are still telling us that they're leaving the province to pay off their debt, and it's not hard to see why. The average student debt in Nova Scotia is over $39,000, one of the highest in the country, and yet we have one of the lowest median incomes in the country as well. And in 3 weeks, we'll have the lowest minimum wage in the country. So in other words, the minister is forcing young people to take on some of the highest debt loads in the country and then enter one of the lowest paid labour markets. So my question, Minister, for the minister, is could he please explain why he thinks that putting young people $40,000 in the hole is such a great policy for Nova Scotia?
Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, gives me another great opportunity to talk about our most generous student loan program, the most generous in the product. Mr. Speaker, when we came in, we eliminated the interest on our student loans. Then, Mr. Speaker, we went a step further and we said to the students, if you graduate, we'll completely wipe out your Nova Scotia portion. So, Mr. Speaker, while this government has increased the funding to universities every year, while the NDP cut out 10%, it's no wonder tuition fees rose. And Mr. Speaker, I will also like to add that not only did the NDP cut 10%, they enforced a freeze on the universities with no prior knowledge, and the universities were stuck with abnormal tuition fees. NASCAD was stuck offering 6 courses for the price of 4, which hurt them very badly. And then the NDP went a step further and they started threatening NASCAD to move them into Dalhousie University. Shame on them.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Transportation. Mr. Speaker, over the weekend I was travelling through the Rotary at Port Hastings by the Causeway, and lo and behold, I looked and there was a car coming at me, coming the wrong way, with Pennsylvania license plates, traveled completely through the Rotary in the wrong direction. Very dangerous. Cars coming from all angles. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are getting used to the rules for roundabouts, This is a rotary with different rules. Tourists are too busy trying to decide which route they want to take to enter Cape Breton Island or where they're going. They're not seeing the yield signs. Mr. Speaker, we've heard of millions of dollars being announced for highways in areas that aren't being twinned to improve safety. Can the minister provide an update on progress for changes that could come for the rotary in Port Hastings?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member for the question. He certainly provides a lot of vigilance for the entry to Cape Breton, which is, of course, very important. It definitely could require some upgrade. There's no doubt about it. It's in the long-term plan. I appreciate the advice in terms of what happened there on the weekend. Unfortunately, sometimes people get confused no matter where they're at, but we'll certainly take a look and see if the signage can be improved.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we certainly hear about it a lot. There's a lot of these incidents, and it's scary to see them happen with my own eyes. Mr. Speaker, I've also raised issues around delays with the swing bridge at the Canso Causeway. And there's an opportunity here. The rotary and the causeway traffic issues are all connected because they're so close together. I have advanced ideas, some of them of which have come from constituents, about improving traffic flow, particularly for people who don't even want to cross the causeway, who have to make it through that rotary. Mr. Speaker, the minister knows the area well. He's a resident not too far away. Can the minister provide some indication before the end of this sitting that would suggest that the government is prepared to do something about the rotary and the potential to improve traffic flow and improve safety?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. As the House is aware, the province recently took over responsibility for the causeway and the attendant issues that he speaks to with regard to the swing bridge that's in there. We were able to improve the bridge and improve the system that last year resulted in significant delays when the mechanism went down. So we've got to that point where we have local service which delays the time. Our department is looking at alternatives for rerouting some of the traffic that may not be going to the causeway, either coming out of 19 or coming up from the Port Hastings area, that would alleviate some of the bottleneck that occurs when the bridge does go down. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've communicated to constituents regarding the Lennox Passage Bridge that links the Alma Dam, to the rest of Cape Breton Island. It's had a rough summer this year, Lennox Passage Bridge. The bridge is the only way on and off Alma Dam, an island with approximately 4,000 residents. Minimal preventative maintenance has forced TIR to weld the span shut because of concerns the bridge might not shut again once opened. And so it has remained closed to marine traffic all summer long. This has impacted tourism and transportation not only in local marinas, but throughout the Brodeur Lakes and the rest of Cape Breton Island. TIR has issued an RFP, thank you very much, to repair the bridge with a total value of $2.9 million. My question for the minister is he confident that given the state of this bridge that $2 million this fiscal year and only $900,000 the next is enough to rehabilitate this bridge into an optimal working condition?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. Again, this is an aging piece of infrastructure that, interestingly enough, has a fairly ancient mechanism associated with opening and closing the bridge. And the estimate that she refers to is simply that. It's a shot at what we're thinking that the cost might be. And the tender actually has closed on the bridge, and we are currently evaluating just what we're going to do in that particular instance. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't realize that bridges that were built in the 1970s are considered ancient. I was born in that era as well, so maybe I'm considered ancient as well. I appreciate that the minister and the TIR employees are working hard to keep that bridge open to marine traffic, but they also realize, my community realizes that we've been having issues with this bridge now for close to a decade. and that the capital plan keeps kicking the can down the road on a sustainable fix. We now know that the tender for the repair work has come in, it's closed, it's come in over budget. As the tourism season comes to a close, Mr. Speaker, people in and around Cape Breton and Richmond are wondering if this will impact yet another tourism season next year. Will the department, Mr. Speaker, commit the necessary resource to complete bridge repairs in time for marine traffic to pass through over the next 2019 tourism season?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is our intention to, at this point, to have the work concluded before the beginning of the next tourist season, before the end of June of next year. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria, the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It must be Transportation Day in Cape Breton, because my question as well is to the Minister of TIR. Last December, the Englishtown Ferry was supposed to be closed to all traffic until April of this year to allow for reconstruction of the ramps and other improvements. Well, Mr. Speaker, April has come and gone, and so have the months of May, June, July, and August. Now we're past Labor Day and still no ferry. This delay is causing worry in the surrounding communities, and rumours are starting to swirl about when and if the ferry is going to finally resume service. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister update this House on the status of the project and when these communities should expect to see their ferry operational?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The project at Englishtown has been affected, of course, by the Mother Nature and the challenges that represents when dealing particularly with ice scour in the area, and that delayed the actually resulted in a significant redesign during the project when it was underway. Recently, Transport Canada has okayed the operation of that facility, and there's some fine-tuning going on, and we're expecting that facility will be open, the ferry will be open to the public shortly. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria, the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, shortly was also May, June, July, and August. Mr. Speaker, having the ferry closed for the last 9 months has inconvenienced residents and businesses and has caused emergency providers possible delays when responding to emergency calls. On April 5th, I rose in this House and shared the concerns of local residents and businesses because the ferry connecting tourists to the Cabot Trail would not be operational during the busy tourist season. Unfortunately for those residents and local businesses, Mr. Speaker, their worst fears were true. An incredible 9 months and the loss of a tourist season that helps local businesses get by during the winter months is gone. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister help to correct a wrong and commit to removing all the Englishtown ferry service fees, and if not, for at least 6 months following the ferry reopening, whenever that might be, in recognition of the inconvenience this project has caused?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I can certainly understand the frustration that particularly the local people are feeling with the loss of that vital service, which, when you consider, Mr. Speaker, represents quite a bargain for the users to be able to cut off that trip through Tarbert Vale and get to your destination much closer. There are costs associated with providing that cost, the same as there is in any of the other highway structures, and we'll be looking forward to getting that back in service shortly. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Wood Street Secure Care in Truro is the highest level of treatment for youth under the care of the Minister. The facility houses some of the province's most vulnerable children and teenagers who are suffering from emotional and behavioural disorders. Residential caring facilities are allowed to use therapeutic quiet rooms, similar to solitary confinement. However, a letter received by our caucus through Freedom of Information indicates the department does not track the number of incidences of children in care of the Minister being held in close confinement or the length of time of each incident. Mr. Speaker, is the Minister satisfied that her department is unable to determine how many children in her care are being held in close confinement or for how long?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I want to inform the honourable member that the safety and well-being of children in our care is our top priority. I do believe that in this particular case they asked for records that exist. Those records do not exist. We don't track that currently, but it is something that we could track in the future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
I'd like to thank the minister for that answer, and we look forward to getting those that data soon. Mr. Speaker, most youth in Wood Street facility are between the ages of 12 and 18. The department's policy on the use of therapeutic quiet rooms states, children who indicate a need to leave the therapeutic room due to sickness, need to urinate or defecate, circumstances involving menstruation or otherwise will be instructed that the request will be approved when the Chief Administrative Officer is satisfied that the child has demonstrated the ability to manage their behaviour. 12-year-old children, Mr. Speaker, held in close confinement and not allowed to go to the bathroom. Mr. Speaker, does the minister think that this treatment is appropriate for children who have been placed in her care?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for her question, and I want to assure her that the safety and well-being of all children placed in our care and our authority is of the top priority. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for WCB. Mr. Speaker, the Workers' Compensation Board of Nova Scotia provides workplace injury insurance to a number of workers across this province. Therefore, when a worker gets injured on the job, they expect to have the peace of mind that they will receive compensation for their injury. Often, the WCB requires that an independent medical specialist offer an opinion on the injury at the centre of a claim. The Minister responsible for the Workers' Compensation Act stated in this House that he would expect WCB to honour the findings of an independent medical specialist. My question, could the Minister inform this House what is the definition of an independent medical specialist?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have the exact definition of an independent medical specialist, but in terms of what the name says, they'd be independent. They wouldn't be subsidized by Workers' Compensation Board, but I can provide the exact definition that WCB qualifies that individual to the member. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Daryl McKinnon, a Pictou County worker, was injured on February 13, 2012. 6.5 years since a workplace accident, he continues to be denied by WCB. Mr. McKinnon was sent by his family doctor to see a specialist about his injuries he sustained that day in the job. The specialist provided his opinion after seeing him numerous times and concluded, along with 4 other specialists that reviewed Mr. McKinnon's case, that indeed it was a workplace injury. So it came as a great surprise when the WCB officials informed Mr. McKinnon that they denied his claim based on a 5-hour visit from another specialist the WCB hired to review his file. My question to the Minister, can the Minister explain why the WCB waits to hear from a hired specialist rather than make a decision from several independent specialists?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not familiar with these particulars of this case. If the member would like to obtain a release from their constituent, I'd be more than happy to review it with them. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sackville Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development, and is about local courtesy busing. Last September, I asked the Minister a question in regards to courtesy busing in the local Harry R. Hamilton schools, and that the distance, of course, set provincially is 3.6 kilometres. And students are bused from 5 to 18. The Halifax Regional School Board had a policy at 2.4 kilometres from grades primary to 6, which the Halifax Educational Centre seems to be still following. The Minister said that a standardization policy across the province is one of the objectives of centralization. My question is, will the Minister please update the House on whether centralization has resulted in a standardized policy across the province, or has he just helped to add to the crisis in busing for students in the Halifax Regional Education Centre?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. I know that for many parents, they experienced busing frustrations the first week of school. There has been significant progress made over the course of the weekend into this week. We are now at 98% of our students in HRM being delivered to school and back home on time. That said, we want to make sure that we do a better job moving forward on having the best busing practices and policies possible to ensure the health and safety of our kids and efficient delivery of our students. So we're currently reviewing best practices within Nova Scotia and our various regions, and also in the other jurisdictions of the country. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In September of 2017, the minister said that there are many people out there who would actually agree having their children walk to school was a healthy exercise. Then again in March, I asked the minister if he would commit to come out to my constituency and join me and a 5-year-old student as we walked the 7.2 kilometres to school and back. According to the Hansard, the Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development at that time replied with an unqualified maybe. My question is, will the minister today commit to come out and participate with me in some so-called healthy exercise by walking the 7.2 to Harry R. Hamilton and Wilson Lake subdivision and back again along Sackville Drive, where there are no sidewalks, very narrow road shoulders, and over 20,000 cars a day?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Part of the review of busing that we're doing right now does entail the various distances that we have for elementary and higher grades in the province. We're also looking at the number of buses that we do have on our routes. I'll remind the member that those thresholds were brought in by previous Conservative government, and I think it is about time that we review those. The fact that we were able to change the governance structure of the education system has actually finally allowed the province to play a very direct and active role in this file. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. And I know as he and his department is starting to get ready for planning for 2019, I thought I would ask him a question of what kind of monies will be available for paving the Trunk 3 highways through our communities, the Trunk 1s, that secondary highway system that's so important to us.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the question is well put, and I thank you for the question. It is that time of year when we are determining where the budget is going for next year, and we've invited all the MLAs to avail themselves of the opportunity to put their particular opinion on what their priorities are directly to the department people who do the planning, and I would invite the member to take the opportunity to highlight the importance of Trunk 3 to our senior management. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, let me do one up. Let me get it on to Hansard, and I'll bring it to Hansard when I do have that meeting with you and your staff. As we flow through Shelburne County, as we come across the Shelburne-Yarmouth County line in Charlesville, there's the highway there, number 3, travels all the way to Barrington Passage. All of it needs to be replaced. That's about 20 kilometres of paving, which would take up all of the budget for Argyle-Barrington as it goes forward. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want him to understand, I want the Minister to understand that it's been neglected far too long. There's millions of dollars of lobsters and fish products that come through there that have to travel over that road, and it's becoming to a state that it is unsafe. So, Mr. Speaker, on Hansard, I'll bring this to the meeting, but maybe he can comment on the availability of Charlesville to Barrington Passage.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I was so happy to present the budget in this year's budget process last spring that increased our capital spending from $225 million to $287 million, a huge increase in our capital spend, unheard of and unseen in former governments, together with an increase of over $2 million in the maintenance budget, which hadn't seen an increase for quite a long time, over a decade. So in terms of the very good points that the member makes with regard to the condition of the highway and the importance of it for commerce, as all our roads are, it is important that the House notes that we are spending more money on capital than this province has seen in many, many years. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Lands and Forestry. Bill Leahy's Independent Forestry Review report has a clear message. If we don't start protecting the ecological underpinning of the forestry sector, we risk it all. this is not news. Commentators point out that Mr. Leahy's recommendations are not very different from the natural resources strategy released in 2011 after years of public engagement and consultation. The NDP began implementing the strategy, but the Liberals have refused to follow it. So my question is, will the minister admit that the Forestry Review report confirms that the government should not have backed away from the goals of the natural resources strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Professor Leahy did submit a report about 3 weeks ago. It's very comprehensive, but it does have a strict focus on the forestry industry instead of a full natural resource strategy. And there are 163 conclusions drafted, 45 recommendations. It's over 70 pages, so the department is ongoing looking at each recommendation, and we look forward to seeing if our analysis supports his recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, 12 organizations representing more than 2,000 woodlot owners have had time to come together and decide to endorse the report, but we haven't heard anything from the government about what it will do. And in the meantime, the same practices that undermine the future of our forests are continuing, including a new announcement of 878 acres of Crown land proposed to be clear-cut. My question is, will the minister commit to implementing Leahy's recommendations?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we will be looking at each recommendation and not just cherry-picking which ones we think will work well in the short term. There's lots of work to do.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for second reading?
We'll now call public bills for second reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 2, Develop Nova Scotia Act?
We'll now call Bill number 2, the Develop Nova Scotia Act. The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 2, Develop Nova Scotia Act, be now read a second time. It is my pleasure to rise in the House today for the second reading of this important act. This bill, Develop Nova Scotia, is the formal last step in the transition of a Crown corporation that is key to the prosperity of our entire province. Until July, Develop Nova Scotia was known as the Waterfront Development Corporation Limited. With that new name comes a new province-wide mandate. It is a mandate that aligns with our government's commitment to drive economic growth and create vibrant places to live and do business in all of our communities, Mr. Speaker. Develop Nova Scotia is about putting these words into action. When this bill passes into law, Develop Nova Scotia will be responsible for managing strategic economic infrastructure across the entire province. That means leading the way to improve high-speed internet for all communities, building on the Bright Star Canada's recommendations. And if you live in rural Nova Scotia, you will understand that high-speed internet is a key piece of economic infrastructure and that will connect our people, help our businesses, and attract all-important investment. The new mandate also means Develop Nova Scotia will be leaders in placemaking across the province, making our communities more attractive places to live, visit, and do business. The Develop Nova Scotia team has already done a tremendous job with this sort of work, thinking about Halifax and the Lunenburg waterfronts, attracting millions of visitors and new business activity. And most recently, the Cove project in Dartmouth, creating a new strategic economic asset that will support innovation and business growth in the ocean economy, one of our most important and thriving economic sectors. At the same time, to mirror the provincial scope of the board, this work of Develop Nova Scotia will expand for the board's perspective to include up to 3 new members to better reflect all regions. Finally, I want to recognize Jennifer Angel, President and CEO of Develop Nova Scotia, and her team for their excellent work and congratulate them on their expanded mandate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to Bill number 2, Develop Nova Scotia Act. Mr. Speaker, I just want to start off by saying that it's wonderful to see that the government is actually moving towards, obviously, and thinking very much as expanding the entire development of Nova Scotia. However, I'm really concerned about the significant amount of money that will be flowing through this Crown corporation, and I'm worried about the amount of oversight or lack thereof that there will be associated with this Crown corporation. There's going to be more uncertainty in economic development, additional layer of bureaucracy, and there's no sense of what the return on this investment is going to be at the end of the day. My former life, I used to do economic development in rural Nova Scotia. And one of the things that was really important when I worked for the Regional Development Authority was that the board of directors were from the community where the development was occurring. There's nobody that knows, obviously, regions better than representation from those actual communities. And I'm a true believer in that, having practiced it myself. There's a concern for me with the way that the Crown Corporation is going to have a board of directors that supposedly is supposed to represent the regional areas within the province, but there's nothing in this bill that speaks particularly about what areas and the percentages that will be represented. So for example, Mr. Speaker, there's nothing in this bill that actually specifically says that Cape Breton Island, which is obviously where portion for which I represent, which is Cape Breton, Richmond, that Cape Breton Island is going to be directly represented in this new developed Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, I guess the overall theme here for me is that there's a bit of a worry about trust and transparency yet again. This Liberal government has proven again and again that it cannot, I'm going to say, Mr. Speaker, cannot be trusted to ensure transparency. And I don't say that lightly, Mr. Speaker. The word trust is something that we should all take, close to our hearts. It's a word that seems to have lost meaning over the years for some reason when it comes to government and to politics. And Mr. Speaker, I think that it's important that we put that at the forefront again and that we have as much transparency in government as possible. This government now wants to spend millions of dollars to expand a Crown Corporation and give it new powers. And since most of its operations would involve the private sector, most of its activity will again be hidden from the public. This is not, Mr. Speaker, what I see as a move towards more transparency and more trust. So I know that, of course, anything within government is you're capable to do a FOI-POP on it, but that is meaningless, Mr. Speaker, under this government and in the only province in Canada where the FOI-POP commissioner is not an independent officer of the legislature, and where the government can simply tell the commissioner no when she requires access to information, Mr. Speaker. To be perfectly frank, Mr. Speaker, I find it rather shameful. The minister can impact the composition and decision of the board, which again, Mr. Speaker, does not speak to trust and transparency. When we look at appointed boards across the province, and that the minister can have basically such an impact on the composition of who can sit on a board, I would rather not see that the decisions that are made in especially rural Nova Scotia, but across Nova Scotia as a whole, is skewed to political party partisanship. So, what could possibly go wrong when I say all of that? Well, I think a lot could go wrong, Mr. Speaker. As far as regional representation under this bill, there's no legislative guarantee, as I said before, that develop Nova Scotia, its board will reflect the regional makeup of Nova Scotia as a whole. We're a very large province, Mr. Speaker. For some, see us very tiny, but we all have, obviously, our specific challenges across this province, and it's really important that we all have an opportunity to have representation around the table when decisions are being made, not for us, but I would hope by us. We don't know how the existing regional enterprise networks, I have the Strait Regional Enterprise Network in my own constituency, and they exist across the province. We don't know how the existing RENs will be handled under this expanded mandate either, Mr. Speaker. So I worry somewhat what the existence for the RENs will be under this new Develop Nova Scotia Act. So who was consulted in this province? Who was consulted before this act was put together and this legislation will be put through? What voice did our municipalities have in this process? And are those organizations about to be fully defunct when it comes to really having an overall ability to be able to give their input into the process of what happens at their own doorsteps as far as development in their regions and across this province as a whole? I think that the government is actually doing a grave disservice, pardon me, Mr. Speaker, to the credibility of this new organization. And I believe, I'm sure, that the government obviously wants it to succeed. But again, Mr. Speaker, I cannot emphasize enough the importance, and I do not see it in this piece of legislation, of the almost mandated or legislated representation of all people in all regions across this province. If this act is actually going to, and this board and this organization is going to act as a consultancy service of sorts to go out into the regional areas of this province, it needs to make sure that its board of directors represents the province as a whole. So again, Mr. Speaker, I'm not one to add more layers of bureaucracy, but this seems to be another layer of bureaucracy with, I'm not really quite sure how much to show for it. Liberals don't have, seems, a plan for connecting underserved areas with the internet beyond the initial money from the still somewhat vague offshore windfall. I almost said secret there, Mr. Speaker, but I'm going to try and stay to, it's very vague. We still don't really quite know the details of the money that has come from the offshore money that's going to be invested into the rural internet projects across this province. So adding new staff and new board members, but, you know, having admitted that private sector is going to be doing most of the work, Mr. Speaker, I'm not really quite sure how effective this organization, this new Crown Corporation rather, is going to be. We don't have a business plan regarding this Crown Corporation, so I'm not certain, and I don't think anybody is quite certain what the new Crown Corporation is actually going to entail. It has no plan. I've seen no plan for it coming across my desk. Strategic economic development as a whole is extremely important in Canada, in the province of Nova Scotia as a whole. It's been a buzzword: economic development, community economic development, strategic economic development. This is not a new concept. It's been around for a really long time. I mean, when I worked in economic development, specifically with the RDAs, and doing entrepreneurship training before that with the Centre for Entrepreneurship, I mean, economic development has been discussed for decades. And again, not to make this all negative, it's really good when one sees that there is some movement, obviously, to try and enhance economic development in our province. But I'm not really quite certain, Mr. Speaker, how this new Crown Corporation exactly intends on doing that, since there's no strategic plan and no business plan that's been put forward. Rural internet and economic development obviously go hand in hand. I'm sure many in the House will remember that in the last session in the spring that I have spoken quite extensively regarding the importance of the lack of internet, specifically in my constituency in rural Cape Breton Islands, lack of cell phone service. These are really important, obviously, infrastructure investments to make across the province, but especially in the rural countryside, so that people in rural Nova Scotia can feel that they are connected to the rest of the world, and that economic development can thrive in rural Nova Scotia as well as urban Nova Scotia. There are places in Nova Scotia, and of course I represent one, that we don't have obviously reliable landline or cell service. It seems incredible in 2018 that we still have this issue in anywhere in North America, anywhere in Canada, but that in my constituency specifically, that we still don't have reliable service to be able to call out for the most basic of services, which is of course 911. It's a sad state of affairs, Mr. Speaker. So what exactly is the mandate for for this government with regard to this act? And will there be an annual report tabled in the House to outline their plan and then give report progress and spending? Or is it again just going to be an issue where we're going to be in this House again at the end of another year or two and asking for obviously transparency and an understanding of where the money is flowing when it's going through this Crown Corporation? So, Mr. Speaker, I have just a few more words, I guess, and in summary, I don't want to sound cynical. Again, it's my way to always try to work positively with everyone in this House. And I understand, obviously, that there's movement here in trying to provide Nova Scotians and the different regions within it with rural broadband service, internet broadband service rather. It's really important, obviously, that we all get connected. It's important as well, Mr. Speaker, not that we're only connected with internet, but that we're also connected, and it's the most basic service nowadays, with cellular coverage. And I know that the Honourable Minister understands the difficulties that we have in rural Nova Scotia, as I've spoken to him about it on several occasions. I don't want to be cynical. It's just really that it's a repeated experience with this government that we're having issues with really trust and transparency. And I guess it's in summary, Mr. Speaker, this has become, or I'm hoping that this doesn't become another situation where government is just saying, just trust us on this, without really giving us all the facts and all the information that we need to make a very important decision. And all decisions that are made in this House on legislation and on bills that pass affect Nova Scotians every single day. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough, Mr. Speaker. And when we say yes to a bill and it passes in this House and then it goes through royal assent, it affects Nova Scotians across this province. And it's really important, Mr. Speaker, that we have all the information that we need prior to be able to say yes or no on a bill that passes on our desks. And that with, Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much for the time to be able to say these few words on Develop Nova Scotia Act Bill number 2.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have a few words here on second reading. We have been and will continue to pay close attention to this new corporation, Develop Nova Scotia. I had the chance to meet with Jennifer Angel and hear more about these plans. And to start on a positive note, I would say I think it's wonderful to see some focus on local economic development from this government. Since I was elected, I have been asking everyone I can think of that has anything to do with the Department of Business, but what about local businesses? Like, where do they go? How do small local businesses get help from this government? And I've had a very hard time getting any answer at all to that question. And so I'm very hopeful that with its focus on placemaking, that Develop Nova Scotia can be a home for what I feel like we lost with rural and economic development when that disappeared. I think the government really has to take seriously that placemaking approach. I think from my perspective, if that is in fact the sort of raison d'etre of this new Crown Corporation, then I would hope to see this Crown Corporation liaise with the Department of Education around school site selection, to liaise with the TIR around active transportation, and to truly take a holistic look at what that frankly buzzword of placemaking actually means. It means creating strong, vibrant local communities that people want to live in. And I think we've learned over the years with the concentration of our populations in the urban areas of Nova Scotia that that takes more than any planning guidebook is going to give us. That actually means understanding the communities on the ground and what they need and what it takes for people to live there. And again, I think school site selection is a great example of that process. I think that there are many concerns. I would echo some of the concerns of my colleague from Cape Breton Richmond. I think we still have a lot of concerns about what this internet plan will look like. You know, we spent 10, 11 years ago, the Conservative government spent $26 million to bring broadband to rural Nova Scotia. We know that that was partially successful, but certainly not at all sufficient. This government is now investing a great deal more money in that project, which is important, but there still doesn't seem to be a fundamental recognition, despite the use of the right language, that this is in fact a market failure. So essentially what we're hearing is, well, we're going to negotiate a better contract this time. But the reality is you're not going to negotiate a better contract when there's nothing in it for the provider. And so I'm skeptical, Mr. Speaker, that this money will be anything more than a giveaway to large corporations who will do some of the work and that will be in the same situation we're in now in 10 years. So I'm very hopeful that we can look outside of the box, so to speak, particularly for this government, at a publicly owned option. I think that taxpayers want to own this particular kind of public infrastructure, and part of the reason for that, Mr. Speaker, is because it brings them something that that we haven't heard anywhere in this conversation around internet, which is affordability. People need rural internet, of course, but they need to be able to afford to pay for it, Mr. Speaker. And even in Develop Nova Scotia's new deck that it's presenting in all of its consultations, we don't see that word affordability. That's not at the forefront of this conversation. And if the internet isn't affordable, it might as well not be there. Mr. Speaker, we know that people need to be able to access it. And we don't have to look any further than another Canadian province, Saskatchewan, to see how successful publicly owned internet is. SaskTel gives Saskatchewan the lowest internet prices and the highest rated customer satisfaction in Canada, and it delivers revenue to the province. It's a revenue generator. So, Mr. Speaker, we look forward to seeing all of this unfold. I look forward to hearing further comments of my colleagues and from the minister. And we are cautiously optimistic and remain vigilant as to how Develop Nova Scotia will evolve.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will open and close my remarks by stating that this bill is further proof that the government is committed to building a stronger province, stronger for our communities, stronger for our residents. And this is a commitment based on strengthening our provincial economy. As we heard last week in the speech from the throne, government will introduce legislation that will support businesses to grow our economy and create jobs for Nova Scotians. Today, we're moving forward on that commitment through the formalization of Develop Nova Scotia so that this fine, progressive organization can evolve from Waterfront Development Corporation. Mr. Speaker, we must and we are doing things differently to grow our economy. In today's globally competitive market for innovation and entrepreneurship, it's simply not enough to say that we're open for business. We must differentiate ourselves from the crowd. And Nova Scotia will differentiate itself by focusing on our greatest natural asset, our place by the sea. Our place by the sea. Place, Mr. Speaker. Place attracts people, smart people, innovative and entrepreneurial people, and such people attract investment. And with investment comes jobs. And with jobs, more provincial wealth that creates greater security for all Nova Scotians. Our place by the sea, our ocean advantage, is what we will harness to give Nova Scotia the competitive edge to develop a new momentum, both now and for future generations of Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, this legislation formalizes Develop Nova Scotia as the province's crown corporation with the authority to lead the development of strategic economic land and infrastructure across the province. That includes real property, improvements to land, improvements to physical assets, which will support strategic sector and population growth. And Develop Nova Scotia will be guided by a strategic framework built on 4 cornerstones. 1, build on our ocean advantage. 2, plan for people. 3, preserve and enhance public access and the public interest. And 4th, foster a culture of innovation and action. In building on our ocean advantage, Develop Nova Scotia will identify high potential property and infrastructure to attract people and investment to Nova Scotia, thereby supporting the development of our ocean sector and contribute to our population growth. It will attract visitors to our shores by enhancing destinations such as Peggy's Cove and iconic tourism sites such as the Halifax and Lunenburg waterfronts and others. In planning for people, or placemaking, Develop Nova Scotia will plan and create authentic, sustainable places for Nova Scotians. It will engage with communities across Nova Scotia. In placemaking activities, it will design and implement programs with our diverse population, reflecting our whole community, while increasing accessibility and balancing our continued economic, environmental, and social development. In preserving and enhancing public access and the public interest, Develop Nova Scotia will steward provincial opportunities, properties, and resources. It will establish financial stability through multi-year program budgets and explore new business opportunities for generating revenue from our properties. Develop Nova Scotia will continually update and optimize internal controls and systems and actively seek out and implement ways to maximize transparency. And fourthly, in fostering a culture of innovation and action, Develop Nova Scotia will enable communities of creative people to draw inspiration from all around our province. It will lead the alignment of private and public sector partners, provincial departments and crown corporations to champion placemaking and economic development. Mr. Speaker, government is committed to and acting upon building stronger, safer, connected communities throughout the province. As the representative for Chester St. Margaret's, primarily a rural Nova Scotia constituency, I recognize the benefits for our communities from increasing the capacity and the reach of our electronic highway. Access to high-speed internet service connects our communities to the world. It retains families in rural Nova Scotia. It attracts businesses to areas outside of the urban areas. And as a province, it makes us stronger. It makes us safer and more connected with each other and with others. I'm pleased that one of Develop Nova Scotia's top priorities will be to work with communities, internet service providers, and other levels of government to build a strong, vibrant, high-speed internet system across Nova Scotia. Working with the Nova Scotia Internet Funding Trust, Develop Nova Scotia will implement government strategy to deliver high-speed internet to 95% of Nova Scotian residents and businesses. Mr. Speaker, Waterfront Development's purpose was to redevelop and revitalize the lands surrounding Halifax Harbour and Lunenburg Harbour. It successfully harnessed the potential of those waterfronts by developing ideas, infrastructure, and experiences that stimulated both business investment and community pride. The spectacular success of waterfront development in these areas and its leadership team has given us full confidence to entrust them with the development of a high-potential property and infrastructure to drive economic growth across Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, this legislative transition of Develop Nova Scotia from waterfront development will be seamless. When drafting the bill, we considered the best practices of Crown corporations and entities, not just in Nova Scotia, but also in other jurisdictions. Mr. Speaker, introduction of this bill to formalize Develop Nova Scotia is further proof the government is taking the necessary steps to protect, strengthen, and grow Nova Scotia. It aligns with government's commitment to drive economic growth and create vibrant places to live and do business. I stand here as a proud rural Nova Scotian and a proud member of this progressive and inclusive government that focuses on building a stronger Nova Scotia for today and for tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Fine, recognize the Honourable Minister of Business. It'll be to close second reading on Bill number 2, the Develop Nova Scotia Act. The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleagues of all sides of the House for their comments on this one. I'll be brief in a little bit of a response, and also I'll temper my disappointment with the opposition's position on this. I know they're always shocked and appalled and devastated by decisions government makes, but every once in a while, Mr. Speaker, I think even the opposition can admit when we get something right, and that's all governments of all stripes. We are spending $193 million to connect Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't matter how you slice it, how you criticize it, the way you position it. It's unprecedented in the Federation. It's more money per capita than any province is spending by a country mile. And it's something that doesn't exist anywhere else. So the purpose of this bill, Bill number 2 for Develop Nova Scotia, is to give us some form of process, procedure, and a home base that plans a massive amount of spending on broadband in this province. That's what this is about. So, one of the comments from the member from Cape Breton Richmond was around another layer of bureaucracy. In the absence of nothing else that could spend $193 million, Mr. Speaker, we need a Crown corporation to carry out this all-important work for many, many people in all regions of this province. We could start over and build a Crown corporation from the ground up, which would be another 6 months, 8 months, and then we'd be criticized for taking too long. So looking at the strategic investment history, experience that Jennifer Angel and her team have at Develop Nova Scotia, it makes perfect sense to create this legislative framework to allow them to carry that out. Again, the member from Chester St. Margaret's talked about Lunenburg, Halifax, Waterfront, the Cove, the strategic tourism investments of $6 million, which we'll spend over the next number of fiscal years. That's all the work of Develop Nova Scotia. Jennifer, her team, the tremendous board that's there, they will carry that out. And, Mr. Speaker, just to be very clear for the House and for all people in this province, Develop Nova Scotia is not going to waste the money because they aren't in charge of the money. An internet trust has been established, as I think all members should know or would know. They don't spend the money, Mr. Speaker. Develop Nova Scotia creates the structures, creates the tendering process, creates the relationship with ISPs, with municipalities, with all stakeholders that have a vested interest in broadband. They're not in charge of the money. They submit their work to the Internet Trust Fund, who control the finances, and they say yes or no. So this isn't a wasteful, we don't know what we're going to do with the money. This is not them making that decision. But let me tell you, for the record, if it were, I would have full confidence in Jennifer and her team. Mr. Speaker, as of every Crown corporation, there will be a report that's produced annually. Jennifer will be fully accountable. The public will be aware every step of the way where every dollar is going, which ISPs are involved, which municipalities, which private sector entities, which satellite companies, which wireless firms. Everyone that's involved in this, it will be very public. They're public dollars. The whole purpose of this bill and of this process is to have accountability and transparency. So that is the point on the piece around accountability. With respect to membership, it's baked right into the legislation that we will be adding 3 additional members to represent the different regions of the province. It's very clear to me and to us, and when we talked about waterfront development becoming Develop Nova Scotia, there's a branding issue. That seems to be something built for the peninsula. Broadband and the broadband solution is province-wide. So, of course, from a branding perspective, from optics, we've got to make sure that we're more inclusive and understand that every part of the region, every part of the province, each region, will be represented by this board and have a fair shot at getting in with the priorities that they have. And again, with $193 million and a good structure and a good foundation in place, every region will have that ample opportunity to access this money, access these programs, and make sure that we're increasing broadband capacity in those regions. Also a comment about consultation and what municipalities were saying. Municipalities were heavily consulted, and the message, the reaction, the feedback was again and again and again, get this money out the door. No more stalling, no more delays, no more funding hold-ups. Get this out the door. Develop Nova Scotia will get this out the door. Municipalities had a very much a decision-making factor in the sense that they needed an arm's-length independent body with the Develop Nova Scotia and with the Internet Trust that would do just that. So that's what the plan is. This is going to work. I've got full confidence, again, in the Develop Nova Scotia team and Jennifer with respect to broadband first and foremost, but also in the strategic infrastructure. And placemaking is critical. When you have government funds and when you're responsible for a fiscal budget and you can allocate funds to initiatives, you need somebody to execute plans. You need somebody to build the proposals, set the table, execute that plan. That's what the strategic infrastructure initiative aspect of Develop Nova Scotia is. So they will consult with education on schools and public facilities. They will consult with health. They will consult with TIR, with tourism, with communities, culture and heritage. There will be a full gamut of explanation, consultation, collaboration on how this money's spent. So what this plan looks like, again, Mr. Speaker, is unprecedented. That's the point, and that's the exercise that Develop Nova Scotia is involved in now. To get this right, public ownership, ISPs, municipalities, they all have a say. They've got a voice at the table. And the only mandate, the only direction that Develop Nova Scotia has gotten from this government is get this right, take your time, be meticulous, get it ready, and when it's ready, we're going to get this money out the door. So that's what this is about. This isn't about corporate giveaways. This is about getting Nova Scotians broadband access. $193 million will do that, and Develop Nova Scotia will get us there. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I close second reading on debate.
Motion is for second reading of Bill number 2, Develop Nova Scotia Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. No. The motion is carried.
Bill number 2, an act to continue Develop Nova Scotia.
Order that the bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 4, Corporations Registration Act.
We'll now call Bill number 4, the Corporations Registrations Act.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 4, the Corporations Registration Act, be now read a second time. Agreed. The amendments of today's Corporations Registration Act validates this government's commitment to promote economic growth and foster the spirit of entrepreneurship. These changes, quite simply, will help encourage new business in this province. They will help more Nova Scotians succeed, Mr. Speaker. These amendments are about strengthening our support for new business development across this great province. And to help give you context, there were approximately 3,000 companies incorporated in Nova Scotia in 2017-2018. Mr. Speaker, these changes will benefit thousands of entrepreneurs who want to start and grow a new business today and well into the future. And here's how. With these amendments, Mr. Speaker, we are waiving the annual registration fee for Nova Scotia companies during their first year of operation. It will continue to be required for out years. We also have amended regulations to the Companies Act to reduce the incorporation fee for a limited company from $336.40 to $200 flat. Both of these changes will take effect January 1st, 2019. So, Mr. Speaker, what this means is simple. In the first year of operation, the cost to incorporate and register a limited company will be $200, which is significantly less than the current combined cost of $454.75. I'm pleased to say that we are going from a province with one of the highest incorporation fees to the lowest in the country. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, for comparison, New Brunswick's fee is $262 for online and $312 for paper. Prince Edward Island is $250. Ontario is $360. Mr. Speaker, business registration was the most cited issue when the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Service Effectiveness held workshops for the business community as an area needing red tape reduction. We are pleased today to start to make some improvements in that area. In addition to going from one of the highest incorporation fees to the lowest in the country, we are also introducing a new service standard. It will now take 3 days for incorporation documents to be processed by the Registry of Joint Stock Companies, compared to the current 5 to 10-day wait. This new service standard will take effect immediately. Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say the benefit of reducing wait times during the critical startup phase cannot be underestimated for any new business venture. In business, time is indeed money. Jordy Morgan, Vice President Lennox of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, welcomed our news last week, saying it was good news for the province's entrepreneurs, now that it will be faster and less costly to set up a new business here in Nova Scotia. Jordy continued to say setting up a new business is challenging, and this will lighten the load. He was pleased to see the work we are doing and continue to reduce red tape for small businesses. The Halifax Chamber was also kind enough to lend their support to our announcement through social media last week, as well as the Canadian Bar Association and Fusion Halifax. Mr. Speaker, Service Nova Scotia has an important role in helping Nova Scotians succeed. The breadth of the work done at Service Nova Scotia speaks to the ample opportunities the office has to contribute to the province's economic growth and help build a stronger Nova Scotia. We are contributing to the conditions to enable the private sector to drive job creation and economic growth and to reduce barriers to success. In fact, Service Nova Scotia has a significant role in government's work to reduce undue burden on businesses by more than $25 million by the end of this year. Mr. Speaker, we are working to build a stronger and more inclusive economy, one that creates more jobs for younger Nova Scotians and one that allows them to focus on what's most important, growing their business. We are taking steps today to support businesses at a critical point in their startup phase. It is all part of our commitment to build a stronger and more inclusive Nova Scotia. Service Nova Scotia will continue to work together with industry partners and engage stakeholders as we continue to aim to strike a balance between reducing red tape for Nova Scotia businesses while ensuring that important protections remain in place. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I conclude my remarks.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you for the opportunity to have once again a moment or two to be able to speak towards Bill number 4, Corporations Registration Act. It's hard to say no, which I'm sure the minister will be happy to hear on such an act. When, of course, it's always positive things to see government trying to reduce taxes or fees in any way, but especially, obviously, to new business owners. Now, Mr. Speaker, with regard to new business owners, I'm not really convinced regarding the messaging on this bill. The government's message on this suggests it would benefit small business, but the legislation is not really targeting small businesses. Having been a small business owner myself and knowing many who are in the stages of startup, many people who are starting up businesses are oftentimes working off their dining room tables. They are working off their kitchen tables. They are working in small office spaces and in other areas that are cost effective. In the agricultural industry, for which I know a few things, having a farm myself, Most farms are not incorporated, Mr. Speaker, and they don't become incorporated until they become multi-million-dollar companies. So for really the government to be messaging this to the people of Nova Scotia and to small business owners, I'm really concerned, Mr. Speaker, that it's sending really kind of a false, I will say a false message. Most people who are in the stages of wanting to do incorporation are well beyond the startup phase. Startup phases, most businesses, as I mentioned, start up very small. They're consultants. For most people in Nova Scotia, they're small business owners that really, we're not looking at people who are making exorbitant amounts of money to start off with. They're people who are looking, yes, of course, and every business does, throughout any stage of their development to try and save money, Mr. Speaker. And again, it's very positive that this government is looking at reducing, obviously, taxes and fees for business owners. But when you get to the stage of wanting to incorporate, has been my experience anyway, you're at a very different stage than a startup. And the messaging seems to be targeted that this is really going to start new startups across the province. And I don't think that that is going to be the case, Mr. Speaker. As much as the minister has mentioned that there was a quote, obviously, from Mr. Geordie Morgan from CFIB, who is in line with what we think is a very positive move, obviously, in reducing fees. He also said, I don't think that you're going to see everybody saying, look, I'm saving $183, so I'm going to go start up a new business. So if government really wants to help business get through the very critical stages before it would be at a stage of incorporation, Mr. Speaker, we have to look at something perhaps a little bit more radical than just reducing fees for a couple $100s. And again, that's nothing to to sniff at. A couple $100 for any new business owner or for anyone in Nova Scotia is a significant amount of money. But at the end of the day, for the most part, it's not going to make or break a small or medium-sized enterprise. Mr. Speaker, I also wanting to mention that in the One Nova Scotia dashboard report, which tracks the goals of the Ivany report for building a new economy, it indicates that the goal of more new business startups is really not progressing. And it concerns me greatly that, not everybody in this province wants to be a business owner. Many people just want to go to work every day and be an employee. They don't want to be an employer. There are a lot of risks involved in being a business owner. And for those people who are really looking at being an employee, it concerns me, Mr. Speaker, that, for example, the employment rate has really climbed significantly from 6.7% earlier this year to 8.4% in August. This government currently still does not have a jobs plan, and we don't talk enough about that, I think, in this House. We still do not see a jobs plan for this province from this government. So as much, again, Mr. Speaker, as it is a very positive move, and I thank this government and the minister for putting forward this bill to be able to reduce some of the fees to not small and medium-sized enterprises, and more medium-scale enterprises that we're really talking about if we want to be really truly honest about it, Mr. Speaker. I think that we have a long ways to go before this, a small gesture, I will say, of this sort really has like a significant impact on a developing business in Nova Scotia. So with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat and look forward to the comments of my other opposition colleague. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll keep it very short on this one. As my colleague said, it's hard to argue with making things a little bit easier for businesses. So by all means, I think reducing red tape, reducing the cost to incorporate is a good thing. I think it's it's a little disheartening that this is bill number 4 of this session of the Nova Scotia legislature. When I think of the issues facing Nova Scotia, reducing the incorporation fee by a couple $100s is not right at the top of the list. But, you know, it's there somewhere, I guess, or it would be if I thought really, really hard about what was important. But you know, I guess I don't have much more to say at this point, but I will say that I think some of the commentators got it right, and what I read in some of the commentary, which was cited by the minister and by my colleague, and these were people who were supportive of the changes, was that essentially this sends a signal. It's a positive signal. It's likely not going to result in any more businesses of any size opening or any jobs particularly being created, but it sends a signal that the government is supportive of business and looking to reduce red tape. So on that count, bully for you, and great, but I look forward to what I know will be swift passage of this bill so we can get on to more important things.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia, will be to close second reading on Bill number 4, the Corporations Registration Act. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I would like to thank my honourable colleagues across the way for their comments. Much of which I agreed with. Certainly, very briefly, I think that without question, a couple $100 is going to make or break a business. In some cases, maybe that is the situation, and anytime anyone can save $200 plus on a business initiative or anything, I think it's good news. But certainly there is a signal that Nova Scotia is open for business. Again, businesses and investors and entrepreneurs don't have to see the dollar amounts to know that reducing red tape, speeding up a process from up to 10 days to 3 days, and becoming the lowest jurisdiction for fees in the country is a significant sign that the government is serious about supporting the private sector. So I know that some of the comments from the opposite side of the hall were geared around that, and I think that we're all on the same page there. And with respect to the comments from the member from the NDP, I certainly understand her position around the priorities here, but for me, I guess coming from my maybe portfolio, I see this as all very important to the bigger picture, from social programs to giving people jobs. If we're going to balance the books, if we're going to beat down the debt, if we're going to put people to work, if we're going to support health and community services and education, we've got to create wealth and we've got to collect revenue. So our job in building the economy and creating more entrepreneurs and creating more businesses in all regions of the province, in particular rural Nova Scotia, is exactly the way to support those social programs. So I think that it's steps like this that get us there. And Mr. Speaker, with that, I'll close debate for Bill number 4.
The motion is for second reading of Bill number 4, the Corporations Registration Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 4, an act to amend Chapter 101 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Corporations Registration Act.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call address and reply?
We'll now call address and reply. We'll now recognize the Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a privilege to reply on behalf of our party to the speech from the throne that was presented by the government last Thursday. Now, the word reply covers a certain amount of ground. It's got some different meanings. On the one hand, it means reply as in respond, as in the back and forth that you would have in a conversation. But the word reply also means at the same time to contradict, or to reply in the sense of offering a retort or a rejoinder. In this sense, it is sometimes said when we talk about a reply, it means to give answer. And this is the sense of the word reply that I want to use this afternoon. It is in that sense a privilege to reply, that is, to give answer to a range of the counterfactual and vacuous positions that make up the government's point of view as we have seen it expressed and articulated in this throne speech. I want to give answer first to the contention in the speech that it is appropriate in any way to use the word opportunity, as this government in fact is using that word in that speech, to describe the dirty work of June 25th, Black Monday for health care in Cape Breton. June 25th, the announcement of the close.
I'd like to remind the honourable member that the phrase dirty work would be an unparliamentary term. The honourable leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't aware of that. I'll retract the term. That Black Monday for health care in Cape Breton, the announcement of the closure of the Northside General and the new Waterford Consolidated Hospitals and the emergency facilities that are contained there, that to use the word to describe that, as the throne speech does, as an opportunity for people, is something to which, in my view, a person ought to give answer. And the answer I wish to give is this, is to say that the government's apparent extraordinary disrespect for the healthcare community and the community as a whole of the CBRM in making this announcement as they did was, in my judgment, hurtful and duplicitous and insulting. Where was the community dialogue? Where was any local conversation? There was no dialogue. There was no conversation. Professor Tom Urbaniak of CBU has spoken about this, I think, very clearly. And I want to quote from his analysis, which I will table. Mr. Urbaniak writes, we never had an organized public dialogue and local process about how to meet the health objectives or benchmarks that we are trying to attain. We as Cape Bretoners never dissected the different options and studied their impact as a community. Instead, the Premier flew in with a few hours' notice, assured us he knew best, and then departed. End quote. Urbaniak's not kidding when he says a, quote, few hours. Dr. Craig Stone, staff anesthesiologist for the CBRM hospitals, who has provided such important leadership in the healthcare crisis in Cape Breton, received an invitation to that announcement at 8:30 that morning without any inkling prior of what was to be taking place. Dr. Abdul Attia was in the same situation. They both arrived in scrubs. Dr. Margaret Fraser, president of the Cape Breton Medical Staff Association, said, "We were essentially blindsided." I will table her remarks. I asked the Premier on Friday if this conduct met the standard of respect for communities and the standard of respect for the medical community that he sets for this government. And he indicated that it did. Lord help us. How could the government have possibly learned so little? Every rally about the healthcare crisis in Cape Breton, and there have been a lot of them, every town hall, every march, every gathering in front of a hospital or in a high school, every one of those has had at its core one consistently articulated message, namely, don't impose on us, work with us. Don't dictate, listen, consult with, pay attention to, communicate with the people who are doing the work already, who are deeply, clinically acquainted with what's needed. And what happens? The Premier blows in on Black Monday with the $350,000 a year CEO of the Health Authority, a couple others, and the MLAs for Glace Bay and Sydney Whitney Pier, and unilaterally saws the legs off the hospitals and the emergency services in New Waterford and North Sydney. Now, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and in this case, maybe it's worth 2,000. Cape Bretoners are familiar with the picture that appeared on the front page of the Cape Breton Post the next morning. I'm going to table it. This is a picture on the top part of the front page of the paper that morning of the row of those who had come to make the announcement of what the government calls this opportunity for Cape Breton. And in the row of the picture, there are, down at the end, the two CBRM Liberal MLAs with their eyes averted, heads hung, hands folded on their haunches, looking for all the world like boys outside the principal's office having received a punishment that they totally deserved. Look, I'm a minister. I've spent most of my working life
Order. The leader of the NDP party is in the speaker is speaking.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I can't avoid a sense, when I look at that picture, that this is a picture of public officials who at some kind of a level have some kind of an awareness that they have been involved in the people that they represent having been somehow disrespected. I think it also disrespectful that the government should have insulted the intelligence of the people affected by this decision with some of the arguments that have been put forward for the hospital closures. Oh, shocking revelation. The facilities are older and in need of infrastructural capital investment. So when your car needs brakes and a muffler, do you junk it and tear up the driveway? Or try this for a piece of logical wonderment. We can't keep the emergency rooms reliably opened, so we have to close them. What? If I went to the doctor with a broken arm and she told me that she was going to enroll me post-haste in the palliative care program, I would be concerned about the quality of the care that I was receiving. So there are problems. There are challenges. There are difficulties, plainly, with the staffing of emergency rooms. But problems, difficulties, challenges, those call for solutions and answers and treatments, not for the termination of the patient. Particularly disrespectful, in my judgment, is the intimation that it is unnecessary and anachronistic to have 4 hospitals with 4 emergency rooms in the CBRM. To begin with, it is a profound misunderstanding to think, and Tom Urbaniak has also pointed this out, that geographic proximity means inherent duplication. It doesn't, which is why in Toronto they've got over 40 hospitals. But further and more nefariously, let me say clearly that there is only one point of view from which North Sydney, New Waterford and Glace Bay appear to be more or less all the same place, and that is the point of view of Halifax, the place to which this government has moved all education decisions with the centralizing of the school board, the place to which the government has moved all health decisions with the centralizing of the health authorities, and to which the government has failed to see, from which the government has failed to see that Nova Scotia is not well served by the Liberal ideology of gathering up everything and centralizing everything that moves. It's disrespectful, and in my view, it is disgraceful that the plan to close the New Waterford and North Sydney hospitals should be proceeding without a glimmer of an answer to the question of how people without vehicles, in the context of the existing CBRM transit system, by which you cannot even get directly from New Waterford to Glace Bay, by the way, How people without vehicles are supposed to going to be able to get to hospitals from which their home is now going to be separated by a $40, $45, $50 taxi trip round trip. It's disgraceful that the Black Monday plan should be proceeding without a glimmer of an answer to the question of where the 271 people who work at the Northside General and the 123 people who work at the New Waterford Hospital are supposed to go now to look for jobs. One thinks of Professor Lachlan McKinnon, who has newly taken up a position in the Department of History at CBU, and whose specialty is the study of the impacts on communities of deindustrialization. And in the course of Dr. McKinnon's studies, there is a common word he uses, a kind of central concept of his work, and it is the concept, the word ruination. What a profound betrayal to visit this level of ruination upon this many people and then have the gall to spin it, to market it, to PR it back to those very people as what the government calls and imagine an opportunity for those people, for their health care. So I want to give answer to this, Madam Speaker, and I want to give answer also to the government's contention that the long-term care sector is so unproblematic and so devoid of pressing issues that the long-term care sector doesn't even merit mention in the throne speech. There are so many things that could have been said, that could have been announced in the throne speech on the subject of long-term care, which would have marked the beginning of this session of the House as a real reset, and which could have marked this throne speech as other than a collection of the platitudinous, which is really what it is. The speech from the throne could have said, for example, something like this: my government recognizes the pressure that the long-term care sector has been under as a result of the $5 million reduction in funding over the last 4 years. My government has heard the concerns of administrators, employees, residents, and families in the sector. And in this upcoming session, the entirety of these funding restrictions will be restored. The throne speech could have said that. A government which was competently knowledgeable and effectively concerned about the long-term care sector might well have done this in the throne speech. This government, however, on the subject of long-term care, so paramount in so many people's minds, has here given us not one single word. No one ought to minimize the impact of the cuts to the long-term care sector as has been being done by the governing Liberals. Nursing home administrators certainly don't minimize it. One thinks of the deep frustration which was expressed this spring in a letter to the families of residents of the R.K. MacDonald nursing home in Antigonish, whose management in that letter spoke about how, although every other avenue had been explored, in the context of those 2 years of budget cuts, management said in the letter to the families, the R.K. had no alternative but, with regret, to lay off continuing care assistance. Administrators don't minimize the impact of the cuts in nursing homes, and neither do people who work in nursing homes minimize the impact of those cuts. All MLAs in the course of their work receive delegations from people bringing forward various points of view and various points of experience they have had. Of all the delegations who have come to see me as an MLA, none has moved me more than a delegation of nursing home employees that came last year from across the province. Mostly these were people who worked in dietary services, in laundry services, and in environmental services, in cleaning. And they came to Halifax to make public officials aware of how living conditions for residents in the institutions where they worked had been deteriorating since the onset of the cuts. 20, 25, even 30-plus year nursing home employees spoke that morning about how, for them, before the cuts, working short was an occasional experience, something that you would have to deal with just from time to time, but that since the cuts, working short had become a regular part of the experience of their work, with observable negative impacts on the tenor and the morale of the home where they worked. One woman's testimony has stayed with me particularly sharply. She spoke about how prior to the cuts, as a cleaner for a couple of decades, she had never ever had the experience of coming to the central stores of the facility and finding that there were no supplies to do her work. But that, she said, since the cuts, cleaning work in her institution had to be discontinued a number of times mid-shift, just because there was nothing for her and the colleagues in her department in the stores for them to work with. So people who work in nursing homes don't share the minimization of the impact of the cuts that the throne speech shows. Administrators in long-term care don't share the minimization of the significance of the cuts in long-term care that the throne speech show. And families of people who live in long-term care do not minimize the impact of these cuts. Over the summer, as a number of cases of questionable care resulting in bed sores became the subject of public discussion and concern, Dr. Jeannie Ferguson of Families for Quality Elder Care and a geriatric psychiatrist was asked to comment. I'll table her remarks to the Chronicle Herald from the 28th of April. She said, "Nursing homes have done excellent work, but they haven't had a staffing increase in 14 years. And in addition, they had a 1% cut in their budgets in each of the last 2 years." One looks in vain through the speech from the throne for any, even the most minimal addressing of any of the levels of this crisis. Similarly, the speech from the throne might have said something like this: "My government has heard the cries for investments in new long-term care facilities. And over the course of our continuing mandate, the shortfall of new nursing home places of recent years is going to be redressed." The impact of the government's failure, Madam Speaker, to invest in new long-term care places is being felt across the span of the health care system. I was pleased to meet with the Paramedics Union early last month, just before their release of startling statistics about frequent shortages of available ambulances around the province. The paramedics spoke with detail, as they did in their release on this subject, and they spoke with precision about how delays in offloading patients at hospitals are backing up the system and causing burnout amongst paramedics, who are often then required to work long back-to-back shifts as the system tries to catch up from the number of hours in which its personnel stand by in emergency rooms. And when the discussion I was having with the paramedics about the figures they were about to reveal on this subject turned to what they would propose to remedy this situation, at the top of the paramedics' list was investing in more long-term care beds. And the reason that was at the top of the list is that that would alleviate the inability at present of emergency rooms to discharge patients to the general hospital population, an ability which is rooted in the fact that the hospital is so chronically filled with people who are only there for the reason that they are waiting for placement somewhere in a nursing home. Now, the facts of this matter are meriting of attention. 21% of the hospital places in all of Nova Scotia are occupied by people who are not hospital patients, but who are rather staying in the hospital. They hope temporarily while they wait for placement in a long-term care facility. The figure is greater than 21% in considerable parts of the province. It's 30% in the western zone, it's 30% in the northern zone of the NSHA. Consider this fact, that over the last 5 years, 2,281 people in Nova Scotia waited in hospital for long-term care between 91 and 365 days, and 15% of those people passed away before the awaited place in a nursing home came open. But none of this merits a little nod. None of this merits a breath. None of this merits any indication in the government's program as it is put before us in this throne speech. Nor is there a nod or a breath or an indication about the need to consider building new nursing homes or to consider reversing those funding cuts in the parameters that were set out last week for the expert panel appointed by the government of the province. And yet we know that every credible voice in healthcare policy anywhere speaks about how all of these matters we need to understand first and foremost about them, they're deeply related. They're all deeply integrated. That's the first thing that policy people speak about when you ask them about the nature of the present crisis and what road we need to go. They say, well, the first thing you got to understand, it's all connected. It's all integrated. It's all entirely of a piece. So I think it's important to give answer to the entire absence, to the complete silence in the speech from the throne about the continuing and deepening crisis in Nova Scotia in the world of long-term care. And I most certainly also want to give answer, in addition to the subjects of the Cape Breton hospitals and the long-term care, I want also to give answer to the contention in this speech from the throne that the government's work in the area of poverty reduction, the contention that in any way it merits the tone of self-satisfied self-congratulation that is put forward with here in this document. Because on the contrary, in the judgment of our party, the thing that would be appropriate for the government's work on poverty reduction would be more a tone of humility, be more a tone of quiet acknowledgement of not having got really very far. That would be more appropriate. That would be more fitting. I attended a striking event in July, the opening of Feed Nova Scotia's new facility in Burnside. I was there with the member for Dartmouth South and the member for Dartmouth North, and we were pleased to meet there also the member for Dartmouth East. By my memory, I don't recall there being any members of the government present there. But at that event, they did an interesting thing. The new warehouses, facilities, are much larger than the old ones. And so that the guests at the opening for the new facilities of Feed Nova Scotia, so that they could grasp this, the people from Feed Nova Scotia marked out and traced out the space, the dimensions of the former facility on the floor of the new warehouse floor. And then the ceremony to open the new warehouse, that was held within this marked out space. And the effect was that because they had the seats for the ceremony within the marked out space, the effect was that you had to step over the line into this space in order to sit down when the ceremony was going to be held. And in addition to the marking they had on the space, the Feed Nova Scotia had also placed a series of about 2 or 3 foot high infographics along that border depicting the character of the situation of hunger and poverty in Nova Scotia. And the result was that if you were going to go in and sit in the chairs where the ceremony was held, you had to walk by and register at some level the information that was contained in those infographics. Here's the information. Infographic 1. 1 in 6 households in Nova Scotia is food insecure, which means lacks adequate food because of money conditions. Infographic 2. Nova Scotia has the highest rate of food insecurity of any province in Canada. Infographic 3. 41,000 people had to receive their food from a food bank in 2017 in Nova Scotia. Let me say, in these opening days of this session, which could well take us into the 6th year into which these Liberals have been the government of our province, I want to say that this is an unconscionable scandal for which the responsibility rests squarely with this government. No amount of condescending pronunciation of the word transformation, No amount of self-aggrandizing breastbeating about the $28 income assistance increase of 2016. None of this changes one particle the fact that the primary authors of the scandal of hunger in our province on September 11th, 2018 are the Liberal government of Nova Scotia. And let's just pause a moment to consider that $20 increase in income assistance from the 2016-17 budget, about which the government does so much unseemly bragging. The truth is that there had been no increase, zero, in the 2 Liberal years before that, and there have been no zero increases since. This government does not have a poverty reduction strategy. They have a strategy for producing poverty-related spin. And let's compare that record, for example, with the record of the government of the New Democratic Party elected last year in British Columbia, which in its first act, other than a thing that had to be done immediately in connection with the wildfire that was taking place at the time, with the exception of what they had to do about that wildfire, in its very first act, brought in a monthly increase in social assistance in BC of $100. Now, I don't diminish in any way the significance of such income-supporting measures as are in fact mentioned in the throne speech, whether these have to do with bus passes or personal allowances for people who don't have a home or the treatment of earned income relative to a person's check. I do, however, think it is important for these matters to be placed in perspective and looked at in proportion. Placed in perspective and proportion relative not just to the depth of the problem, but also to the wider scope, the bigger seriousness, the more really dealing with the matter that we see in jurisdictions elsewhere. In comparison to which, when we compare ourselves to that $100 bought on day one of that new government, in comparison to which what has been delivered on this subject by the Liberal government of Nova Scotia can't be described as other than a pittance and very paltry. And on the subject of keeping things in proportion and thinking about comparatively about our position in the rest of the country, I also don't want to overlook the fact that in the course of this current session, it is very likely, with the scheduled change to take place in Saskatchewan in the minimum wage on October 1st, it is very likely that in the course of this session, in about 3 weeks, Nova Scotia is to become, we're on a pace to, become the province with the worst minimum wage in our whole country. And this is going to happen on precisely the day, October 1st, that in Alberta, the 3-year march towards $15 is going to be completed. And this is happening in a context across our country, a context in which a commitment to $15 has been made in BC, in which Ontario has made the move to $14. And it's also in a context in which, while we're in the comparison with the rest of the country business, it's a context in which we have the 3rd highest paid premier in the country, and we have the only premier in Atlantic Canada that the people of their province are paying more than $200,000. So I want to give answer to the thought that any of this is acceptable. And I want to say that it is unacceptable, and it is contemptible, and it is a scandal. And there is much more that, if time permitted, I would wish to give answer in this throne speech. A great deal of effort is made by the government in the throne speech to associate itself with the successes of young people in the province. And I want to give answer to the fact that in the course of this, the government fails entirely to acknowledge the enormous burden it continues to lay on the young people of the province by continuing the situation in which we have the fastest rising tuition in the country. The throne speech uses the word, it speaks about how young people are showing, this is actually the word that's there, how young people of the province are showing courage. Well, I think it takes courage to look towards Ontario, where if your household's making less than $50,000 a year, your tuition at an Ontario facility is paid by the public of the province. It takes courage then to look at New Brunswick, where if your household's making less than $60,000, your tuition is paid at a New Brunswick institution by the public of the province. Or to look to Newfoundland and Labrador, where tuition is just slightly over $2,600, or to look to Quebec, where it's just a little bit more than that, and then to look back at Nova Scotia. It takes courage to stomach and take in that here in our province, average tuition is $7,726. All of this deserves to be given answer, but more than anything else, I want to give answer now to the core outlook which defines the Liberal enterprise in Nova Scotia, and which, in my view, is exposed in its unworthiness in this throne speech. And that is that all of this, as it has been presented, is as good as we can in our province at this moment hope for. It's not a crime, you know, to have written a bad speech. Most public figures, certainly myself included, would have done that a time or two. It is, however, precisely a crime to be entrusted with the governance, to be entrusted with the leadership of people in a time of sharp and pressing felt need, and then to offer no ideas, to offer no goals, to offer no program. I reject the idea that what we see in this throne speech is a government that is building itself on incrementalism. This is not incrementalism. This is nothingism. And why? Because this government lives entirely under the umbrella, is completely under the sway of one core, now discredited and erroneous idea, namely, that we ought not to aim for anything except as can be accomplished within the limits of an annually balanced budget. This throne speech is a starkly clear measure of precisely where this stale, dated Thatcherism gets us. The government is going to, it says there, the government is going to what? Oh, it's going to bring in a Traffic Safety Act. Well, yeah, right, good. And, well, the government is going to make it cheaper to incorporate a company. Well, yeah, good, right? And well, you mean that's kind of it? That's your program? You're moving into year 6, and that's what you're bringing? It's a bag of zeros in a box of hubris. And every one of these areas of failure that is brought into view by the thinness of this throne speech is the result of concrete choices which have been and are now being made by the Liberal government of Nova Scotia. We do not have the appropriate amount of nursing homes in Nova Scotia because the Liberal government has decided it is a higher priority to have a budget surplus. The nursing homes we do have are not adequately funded because the Liberal government has decided that it is a higher priority to have a budget surplus. 1 in 5 of our children, 1 in 3 in significant regions of the province lives in poverty because the Liberal government has made the decision that it is a greater priority. It is of higher priority. It is in a larger place to have a budget surplus. People every day overcome with anxiety. People overcome with depression arrive for help at our public mental health services and receive appointments in 4, 6, 8, 10, sometimes 12 months' time. Why does this happen? It's a solvable problem. It happens because the Liberal government has made a decision that it is more important than delivering those timely services that we should have in Nova Scotia a balanced budget. Young people are unable in our province to establish themselves in the world because the burden is sitting on them so heavily of educational debt. Why is that? It's because the Liberal government, now moving into its 6th year, has made a decision that might not be a good thing, but it is not as important, the solution to it, as producing a budget surplus for the province. These are wrong decisions. These are wrong decisions which are rejected now by such a growing chorus of people. Wrong decisions rejected by a growing chorus of economists, of authors, of commentators, of jurisdictions going in a different direction, of leaders in our province, of leaders in different communities, all of whom understand the exciting and the hope-filled doors that can be opened when governments stop worshiping their surpluses and invest instead seriously in the needs and the futures of their people. Let it be stated absolutely clearly. We don't have to have a health care system that is broken at the level of primary care, emergency care, long-term care, and any other kind of care that you might care to mention. We don't have to have communities whose efforts to attract new people and retain and bring home their own are undermined by emergency rooms that are closed as often as they're open. We don't have to be at the bottom, the province with the highest proportion of their population who can't afford to buy their groceries, the province with the lowest minimum wage, the province with the most unrepayable levels of tuition. I think of a marvelous song by the British indie rock band Florence and the Machine. It's on a terrifically titled album. The album's called High as Hope. And the name of the song is We All Have a Hunger. We all have a hunger for something profoundly better. And make no mistake, it is absolutely coming. The arc of history holds that promise. But first we have to take all of this false and self-flattering failure and move it to one side. And we're at that, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
I recognize the honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a great privilege to stand here today and to be the representative from my home area, Cumberland South. Sort of taking the family reins, if you will, as my late grandfather, Honourable D.L. George Henley, served this assembly. From 1963 to 1984, he was a well-respected, thank you, former constituent of the old constituency, Cumberland West. I'm very humbled that the people of Cumberland South have granted me this opportunity. No one would be able to achieve this goal if it were not for the lives and dedication of close family and friends. I'd like to recognize, since January, my wife Tracy has stood beside me 100%. My two boys, Bailey and Cooper, and my 2-year-old daughter, Briar. Ever since day one, when we talked about this adventure, what might happen to Dad, they've been there 110%. My family has never eaten so many pancake suppers in 1 month. The support of other family members, such as brothers and sisters, but especially my mother and father, Les and Nancy Rushton. I would not be able to stand here today if it were not for their dedication and their question, boy, what are you getting into? And of course, the campaign team, the association back home, and my friends here today. The support has been overwhelming, the dedication, and to make sure in a by-election that I came here into this House very comfortable. I thank you for your support. The best of all the reception are the people of Cumberland South. They have shown me since this election that Nova Scotians truly are great people. Their reception has been second to none. My quick story, I'm a lifelong resident of Oxford. 20 years in the fire service. The last 10 years I've worked for Oxford Frozen Foods, and the past 2 as a production manager at the Onion Ring facility. 8 years prior to that, I am a licensed electrician. The last 12 years of my life, I have been the fire chief of the Oxford Fire Department and have served many associations, and I'm currently the president of the Maritime Fire Chiefs Association. With this leadership, dedication, and community service is one reason why I felt the need to run politically. I got into politics because I love my province and I love my country. And yes, my family history and my namesake helped me push my way through to the election this past June. And as a young boy, I always wanted to be a firefighter, but deep down inside, watching my grandfather, even after his retirement, still serve the people of the Cumberland area, made me want this job even more, and it truly is, and I think everybody in this House will agree, a great job. I'll take you for a little tour around Cumberland South. If you were to come from New Brunswick, you are into the gateway of Nova Scotia. You leave Amherst and hit number 2 highway to the entrance of what used to be the Rainbow Bridge that is currently closed. Locals know it as the Rainbow Bridge. We now know a Bailey Bridge that carries all the traffic from Cumberland North to Cumberland South. Over the last few months, since April 19th, we were honoured and pleasantly happy to hear the announcement from the Minister that the bridge would be replaced. 5 months later, still no bridge, still no tender. So we go on through the detour. We hit Napanamakan, which were once rich farming communities. I believe that opportunity is there again. The dedicated and hard work of the people of River Hibbert and Joggins area. I had the privilege to go to a country Masonic benefit a few months back where the Masons held a fundraiser for the local 4-H. The 4-H program thrives very strong in Cumberland County, and we're very proud of this program. 2 weeks ago, these 4-H students celebrated their year-end rewards at the Cumberland County exhibition held in Oxford, where they celebrated their 100th anniversary of exhibition experience. Sense of community in River Hibbert and Joggins, and down to the beautiful hidden shore of Manuti, is represented by the River Hibberts and Joggins Development Association. Recent improvements to the Joggins War Memorial attest to this dedication that these people have in their spirit. You could stop at Maggie's for a burger or the new McPuffin's Atlantic Seafood before you hit the adventures on the Joggins Cliffs. Or you could take it out to a local entrepreneur, Brian and Laura Hibberts, who own and operate Fundy Treasures. Brian and Laura gather treasures, jewelry, and make candles, and renowned throughout the country as the rock guitar picks, which were a present at the Country Music Awards gift baskets for the musicians. Your Bay of Fundy experience truly begins here in that area. The Fundy Geoparks, the Fossil Cliffs, the world's highest tides, the scenic heights, camping, family adventures, and great food. As you go through Shuley heading to Advocate with a population of 2, you have to take the opportunity to stop and visit with the people of Advocate. You truly will not find a more humble, generous people in Nova Scotia. Prior to arriving in Advocate, every car you meet will give a friendly wave. Their door is always open, the coffee pot is always on. As you leave Advocate and stroll out through towards Spencer's Island, it's truly a picturesque moment. And if you're there on a Saturday night, you have the advantage of open night mic, where you experience the local talents of the Advocate people. Before you do leave Advocate, though, you should take the advantage of the Cape Door, the hiking trails, the camping area, and the beautiful scenery of the Bay of Fundy. Fox River, Port Greville, and Wards Brook, in reverse, because it's locally known as FPW, is the location of the Age of Sails Museum, where you can learn about the ancient shipbuilding years past. Or you can take part in the Firefighter Field Days, where they just recently celebrated their 50 years of service to the area of FPW. Just outside of Parisboro from Diligent River, you'll see vast wild blueberry fields. In mid-August, you will see fields of blue, minus this year due to the frost that we have had this early June. It is truly a damaging blow to the area of Cumberland County and Nova Scotia as a whole, damaging much of this year's crop. These fields are shared with the mountains of maple that connect the Cobblecook Mountains right straight through to Wentworth Valley. Once in Parisboro there's much to see and much to do. During the campaign months, you would meet many people that have come back from West, Ontario, US, back to their home area of Parisboro to retire because of the picturesque scenery. Shops and stores that once were not long ago empty have been taken up by the artisans of the Parisboro area. You can visit the beautiful Ottawa House Museum by the sea, which was once home to Sir Charles Tupper, and learn the history of one of our founding fathers of Canada. You cannot forget the Fundy Geological Museum that is fun-filled for kids and adults alike. As you head back on the trail, the next stop we cannot forget, get your picture taken with Glooscap at the Old Town Hall in Parisboro, a statue of the Mi'kmaq legend. Between Parisboro and Spring Hill, you will find Southampton, a small community but very proud with their baseball heritage. Spring Hill is hometown of our very own Anne Murray. The Anne Murray Centre can be seen busy from May to the end of October. Spring Hillers have a great deal of pride, and it is trenched deep within their coal mines. I must take a moment to remember honest Ken Melanson, a miner that was trapped underground for 80 hours in the bump of 56. He passed away earlier this summer. And Herb Pepperdine, who I recognized earlier during this afternoon session, who was in the bump of 58 and passed away earlier this week. And a true Nova Scotian hero that I should recognize, who passed away earlier this year in late winter, Dr. Arnold Burden, who was a true rescuer for both disasters in Spring Hill. We should recognize them as a group. Spring Hill has much to celebrate and much more to come. Home of the main office of the Cumberland campus of the Nova Scotia Community College, we have the state-of-the-art arena by the name of Dr. Carson Marion Murray Community Centre, which uses geothermal to freeze the skating surface. With the works of the municipality, plans are in full force to create a full-functioning geothermal industrial park in this area. The Pit Pond revitalizing job and track, which is undergoing and just received provincial funding, which the community thanks. We look forward to working to the department and seeing the project fulfilled in a productive manner. Baseball runs deep in the community of Spring Hill. The Fence Busters is a well-known baseball name within the area. Baseball didn't necessarily start here, but this past weekend, we certainly finished it. This has been a historical year for the community of Spring Hill. The Stone Twins and the Rushton Twins both played for the Truro Bearcats and went west in the under-18 national championships. Elena Porter and Avery Smith competed on Team Nova Scotia a few weeks ago in Bedford, on Team 1 and Team 2 of Nova Scotia in the under-16 Canadian championships. This past weekend, the Mosquito, or under-11, Fence Busters went undefeated to win the Nova Scotia provincial title. Avery Smith traveled to St. John's, Newfoundland as well this past weekend with Oxford native Haley Jackson, who both played for the girls' Nova Scotia team under 14 and brought home gold from the Atlantic Championships. Congratulations to all. Before you leave Spring Hill, take a moment. Visit the Anne Murray Centre. Spring Hill has a historic past of devastating Main Street fires and the bump of 56 and 58. Take a chance to learn this history at the Miners Museum. Spring Hill has much to be proud of and much to look forward to, with the recently announcement new elementary school that will replace two aged and outdated decayed schools. This has been a long time coming. Spring Hill is very proud of this announcement. As you continue through Spring Hill, onto the Valley Road, you can play a round of golf before leaving the community and entering Collingwood, where you can stop by and have one of those famous pancake dinners. I especially enjoy the strawberry dinners myself. As you go through the road leading to Westchester, take the time to see the area, fish the lakes, hunt the woods, and the vast network of trails that can connect you through almost anywhere in northern Nova Scotia. If you're a person that loves the Four Seasons, Wentworth is your spot. In the next few weeks, we will see the leaves and mountains turn colors. Ski Wentworth will open their chairlift for tours and prep for the snow to be coming very soon. As you round back into the Oxford area, the wild blueberry capital of Oxford and my hometown, you will see the home of the Oxford Frozen Foods Limited, started by John Bragg, who just recently celebrated his 50 years of business in the Oxford area. Oxford is now home to Spring Hill native Chris Brown, an up-and-coming musician who is now on the Nova Scotia charts for one of his hit songs. Oxford has some of the best salmon fishing with two rivers that connect right in downtown Oxford. In the trail system that would lead anywhere with the introduction of the underpass on the highway. I almost forgot. 3 weeks ago, our ever-popular sinkhole used to be a swimming hole. Oxford has never been so popular in the news as it has been the past few weeks. Fishing hole. But I find it very surprising. Even as I walk down in here and into the house, people ask, how's your sinkhole doing? When most people may not realize our 8-year-old unoccupied school sits vacant this year. As you leave town on Route 204, you will travel through Leicester. And remember I said earlier about pancake breakfast? Do not go to their Good Friday celebration and go away hungry. Residents of Cumberland South are a proud, friendly group of people. The scenic, laid-back lifestyle with the gateway through to Nova Scotia and the tourism industry and the Bay of Fundy adventure truly does start here. We need to promote and draw from the highway to expose our hidden gems and buried deep within Cumberland South. A large percentage of Nova Scotia's wood fibre comes from Cumberland County. We need to utilize and maintain our natural resources in the proper manner to sustain this lifestyle for Cumberland South in years to come. We need the commitment from this government to help secure health care. It's breaking news in our area if the ERs are actually open. Door knocking in the last few months, the vast amount of stories of people without doctors, a heartfelt cry from one lady who just found out at the ER a few weeks prior that had cancer but had no family doctor to go to. We need these ERs covered. We need doctors, and we need the commitment from this government to work towards that. Our roads need attention just like everyone else's in the province. The bridge that affects the lives of almost everybody in Cumberland County, being the Rainbow Bridge, we need to move forward on this project. On August 23rd, my home community was surprised to find out that our children would not be returning to our P-12 school this year due to some issues. Families that see a 6-year-old child, just so I can paint a picture for you, getting up at 5 a.m. to get on the bus for 6. Some families don't get their older children home till well after 7 due to the split shift. The safety of the children and staff, yes, are first and foremost. I applaud the Department of Education for taking care of the safety of my child in this manner, but there are answers that need to come. Questions are unanswered. I have also applauded the welcoming hospitality the Village of Pugwash has extended to our children and our staff. It is second to none. I urge the Minister to use his position to move this business in a timely manner to find out the answers for these families, these children, so we can get back to our rightful home. This is an 8-year-old building built by taxpayers in Nova Scotia. We as elected officials have many answers, and we're looking for many answers. One question that is unanswered is why, when the Chignecto Central knew about this on August 7th, it took just a mere 2 weeks to actually announce that our lifestyles would change for our children, merely 7 days prior to the children returning to school. Why are we nearing a month of knowing everything that's going on in this school and still no answers? I have offered to work with this government to find answers for my community. I've reached out, and I will continue to do that and question during the proceedings of this House. We need to be moving forward on these issues, no matter whether it's the bridge, the school in Oxford, or the announcement of the Spring Hill Elementary School. When are doctors coming? We cannot afford to stand still on these issues. Madam Speaker, I take this job very serious. It's a job like none other, and in a mere 2 months, I'm very humbled to be able to stand in this House where my grandfather once stood. I'm humbled to be the voice of Cumberland South. Many people have aspirations of running in politics. My dream did come true, and for that, I'm greatly thankful. I look forward to everybody in this House, with respectable debate at most times, to better this province as we all have run in this position to make this province better to what we believe. We can do it. I again thank you, my wife Tracy at home, and my kids for the undedicated support that they have shown me. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move adjournment and reply to debate. Thank you.
The motion is to adjourn, address, and reply. Would all those in favour say aye? Aye. The motion is carried. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And on behalf of the government side and all members of the House, I would like to certainly congratulate the member for Cumberland South on a job well done. Great to have you in this historical place, and we know you'll do good things for your constituents, for all Nova Scotians, so great job. Madam Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. I move that the House to now adjourn, rise to meet again tomorrow, Wednesday, September 12th, between the hours of 1 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. And I would now ask the Deputy House Leader for the official opposition to provide the government's business.
I recognize the Honourable Deputy House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I too would like to applaud my colleague from Cumberland South on the great job he did today and delivering his maiden speech on response to the speech from the throne. His grandfather would be quite proud of him, I'm sure. Madam Speaker, tomorrow, after regular routine and question period, we will be calling resolution number 18, bill number 19. Madam Speaker, I now move that we adjourn until tomorrow, beginning the House at 1 until 5:30 p.m.
The motion is that the House rise to meet again on Wednesday, September 12th, between the hours of 1 and 5:30 p.m. Would those in favour of the motion please say aye? Aye. Contrary-minded, nay? The motion is carried. We stand adjourned until tomorrow. Oops.